today we're going to do Revelation 4, but it's only part 1. We're going to hit stretches like this too, where there's just something that's sort of lurking behind the backdrop of a chapter, or that we have to sort of cover first, and that's going to set up, some of the drill down stuff. So, today we're going to look at Revelation 4 and get our feet wet there. And again, what we're doing in this series is it's all about the repurposing of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. And today we're going to see how John repurposes an Old Testament genre. And that is called in Old Testament scholarship the covenant lawsuit genre. It's also known as the covenant lawsuit treaty. So there's a lot of scholarship behind this. There's a pretty solid consensus of scholarship, in fact, that Revelation 4 and 5 is a divine council scene that utilizes features of the covenant lawsuit genre from the Old Testament. So today, we want to be talking about what that genre is, what are the elements, and once we go through the elements, you're going to kind of see, if you think about Revelation 4 and 5, that, the chapter does kind of like unfold in this particular way. And that's going to inform certain items in these chapters, basically how to read them, or this is the bigger picture, Old Testament bigger picture. Here's what the passage is accomplishing. And then there's this other thing over here that's a little more, nuanced, or drill down into a specific passage that John, might use or repurpose in part 2. So, this is going to be fairly broad, this episode. Now, we've had on the show before Alan Bandy, and I'm going to be interacting with 3 sources here, really using 3 sources. They're all dissertations, and they've all been since, I'm sure, revised in some way and published into expensive books. So I'm going to be using the dissertations. I've uploaded all 3 of these dissertations into the protected folder for the podcast. So if you want, to get a hold of the original dissertation and not the published book, you can do that. And so any page number I refer to here is going to be on, about the dissertation, not the book. But Bandy's dissertation is one of these. And again, we've had Alan Bandy before to talk about his work. And so we're going to sort of revisit parts of that. And then I'm going to add a few other things from some other sources. So Bandy's dissertation was entitled The Prophetic Lawsuit in the Book of Revelation. This is his PhD dissertation from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in 2007. He is going to reference an older dissertation a lot. I mean, he references a number of works, but one of them is a dissertation by R. Dean David. And the title of that one was The Heavenly Court Scene of Revelation 4 and 5. This was a PhD dissertation done at Andrews University in 1987. And the third source that I'll draw on is Myra Kensky. Her dissertation was Trying Man, Trying God. Subtitle, The Divine Courtroom in Early Jewish and Christian Literature. This is a University of Chicago dissertation from 2009. And I should add that her work actually includes a chapter on rabbinic literature too, even though the title, doesn't make that completely evident. Because when you see early Jewish, you think Second Temple Judaism, not rabbinics, but she actually has a chapter on rabbinics as well. So I'm going to be interacting with all 3 of these to sort of explain, what is the covenant lawsuit genre and how does it show up in Revelation 4 and 5? And to be honest with you, there are scholars that would argue that the whole book of Revelation draws on this genre in a number of respects. But we'll drift off into that a little bit. But we're going to maintain our focus here on these 2 chapters. So I'm going to start with Bandy's dissertation. What he does, again, he is going to, as sort of the title indicates, the prophetic lawsuit in the book of Revelation. I mean, his dissertation is not isolated to chapters 4 and 5. So he's going to in his dissertation show how the prophetic lawsuit, this covenant lawsuit genre, is utilized and repurposed in various places in the book of Revelation. So what he does in his dissertation is he begins with discussing all the literature that has gone before, the work that has been put into the prophetic lawsuit genre, and then noting specifically writers as well that dip into the book of Revelation for this here and there. And then his work's really going to expand on the theme and really give it concerted attention specifically in the book of Revelation. So he goes through, in his introduction, lots of different approaches to this. So it's very evident that there's some kind of covenant or treaty or lawsuit background. Like when you hear lawsuit, think a courtroom scene. All right. Bandy points out, scholars have noticed this for a very long time. The only question is, well, which genre or which ancient Near Eastern, genre or examples are the best ones, to really understand what's going on here. So he goes through all these different options in his early chapter, and he notes, strengths and weaknesses of a bunch of them. For instance, when he veers into Revelation, he refers to David Chilton's work. Chilton, I don't know if I presume he's still living. His book that Bandy spends a lot of time on is Days of Vengeance, an exposition of the book of Revelation, which was 1987, so it's not that old. But anyway, Chilton is sort of in the Christian theological arena. He's eschatologically, he's a preterist. In that arena, Christians who do eschatology, he's one of the few that really spend a lot of time on this covenant framework for the book of Revelation. So he spends a lot of time, Bandy does, talking about Chilton and, again, strengths and weaknesses, some critiques here and there. One of his critiques of Chilton is he depends a lot on Meredith Klein's articulation of covenant elements that we should be paying attention to. And, Klein wrote earlier, than the 1980s. And so, some of that work is going to suffer because it hasn't been brought up to date. Again, this is just a chronological issue. But to be more specific, on page 38, Bandy writes this. He says, the 5 points of the covenant structure, this according to Chilton, include 1, a preamble to identify the king, a historical prologue. That's number 2. Number 3 is ethical stipulations. In other words, the terms of the covenant. 4, sanctions outlining blessings and cursings. And 5, succession arrangements dealing with future generations. And so he talks about how, Chilton views the backdrop of the book of Revelation as essentially a lawsuit against Israel, against Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And that's going to lead him in a certain direction in interpreting the book that, fits really nicely in the preterist camp. Bandy writes, Chilton views the covenant lawsuit describing the last days of the covenantal nation of Israel, which was fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And then he writes, Chilton's approach, however, differs from most scholars in that he arrives at the lawsuit through his covenant framework for Revelation instead of through the occurrences of juridical language and imagery. This results in part from the fact that his commentary is an exposition of the English text rather than the Greek. Likewise, Chilton argues that Revelation does not contain a prophetic lawsuit, but it is a lawsuit based on the 5-point structure of ancient Near Eastern covenants. And he gets that from Klein. The problem with this thesis is that he overstates his case for the covenant framework serving as the structure for Revelation. And then elsewhere he says, to say that the entire book of Revelation intentionally follows the structure of ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties proves difficult to validate. Let me just stop there. So what Bandy's going to do is he's going to say, look, there's a better option than what Klein was doing. Not all the book of Revelation is a covenant or belongs in the covenant structure, but various parts of the book of Revelation do construct scenes like their lawsuit scenes, again, courtroom scenes. Revelation 4 and 5 is the most prominent of these. So he's going to say, an approach like Chilton's a bit exaggerated. So I bring up Chilton because, again, he is in the Christian orbit. We're going to have listeners who are familiar with Chilton, and they're going to think that covenant lawsuit backdrop to the book of Revelation is Chilton. It's not really the case. What Chilton was doing is something a little bit different. And again, Bandy's going through a whole bunch of people, but again, I picked Chilton because he's going to be familiar to a lot of people in the audience. So pluses and minuses, just like everything else. Again, one of the things he likes about Chilton is that, for instance, his insight that the 4 series of 7 judgments in the book of Revelation are based on Leviticus 26 warrants serious consideration. Again, that's going to show up later in the book and in some of the specific things we see in the book of Revelation. So again, there are important things here that a writer like Chilton and those who follow him are going to be tracking on, but that is not what we're going to do today. That is not what we mean by the covenant lawsuit genre. It's bigger than what Meredith Kline wrote. It's bigger than what Chilton wrote, and it's also different in some respects. So the observation, let's just take as our point of departure here, this 4 series of 7 judgments based on Leviticus 26. That's going to factor into Bandy's own contribution, that the sections of the book of Revelation, various sections, are framed by, again, this prophetic courtroom, this prophetic drama sort of scene. If you think back to Leviticus 26 and passages like Deuteronomy 28 and 29, where God lays out, again, these basically the stipulations for blessing, and then if those are violated, then you're cursed. Those passages, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, 29, are often used in the Old Testament in other places as the basis for the prosecution. In other words, God is upset at Israel's apostasy, and then a prophet will put Israel in a courtroom scene, and God begins to build a case against his people Israel. And in this is going to in part explain why the Assyrians are going to come and conquer you, or why the Babylonians are going to come and conquer you. So these cursings, again, they come from these earlier chapters, these violations of the covenant. I mean, Leviticus 26 is Torah. Deuteronomy 28 and 29 is Torah, okay? It's part of the covenant, God makes with Israel. These violations are going to become the basis for God's judgment. And articulating the case against Israel is going to be part of the covenant lawsuit genre. So all of that's legit. Again, where Bandy would say Chilton goes too far is to try to make like the whole book of Revelation somehow following these covenantal structures and whatnot. It's an exaggeration of the case, but the case itself in parts of the book is legit. And Revelation 4 and 5 is a big place where this is very evident. Plus, it takes place in the divine courtroom. So it's a divine council scene. Now, Bandy again, summarizes all this, and he gets to the part of his dissertation where he gets into R. Dean Davis's dissertation, which is one of the 3 sources I mentioned at the beginning. So part of Davis's dissertation deals with the divine council specifically as a deliberative body. Again, think of a courtroom, sort of like God as judge. Okay, and the council is the jury, or at least they're participating jurors in concert with God, who in many cases God is also the jury. He's the judge and the jury and the prosecutor in some of these scenes. And Bandy writes of Davis's study, again, here's how he summarizes it. He says, Davis's thematic analysis of Revelation 4 and 5 attempts to portray, 1, a covenant context within a temple setting. Think of God's throne room here. 2, a heavenly court scene involving a divine council. And 3, an investigative type judgment of the Lamb in corporate solidarity with his people. Davis isolates 5 themes evident in chapters 4 and 5, which includes A, temple theology, B, ontological cosmic unity, C, judgment, D, covenant and royal theology, and E, Trinitarian involvement in salvation. The subsequent chapters attempt to explicate these themes as they relate to the Old Testament and Revelation. Now, some of that language, especially investigative judgment, is going to sound like Seventh-day Adventist theological stuff. And that's correct, because Davis is an Adventist. And Andrews University, where he did this dissertation, is an Adventist school. And Bandy's well aware of this, and so he's gonna push back on some of that kind of content. But the important thing about Davis's work for us, and really for what Bandy's doing, is again bringing the divine council sort of front and center into this. And so he writes elsewhere about Davis. He says, a major corollary to Davis's analysis of the heavenly courtroom scene is the presence of the divine council. In chapter 4, Davis reviews 1 Kings 22, Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1 through 11, and Daniel 7 as significant Old Testament passages for interpreting the role of the divine council, heavenly beings, in Revelation 4 and 5. After a summary of each passage, he provides an analysis of what those passages reveal about the divine council. Davis also discusses the terms, location, members, and decisions of the divine council in an integrative summary. He argues that in the covenant lawsuit, Yahweh functions as both the prosecutor and judge. whereas a member of the divine council functions, in other words, like the Son of Man or somebody like that. Members of the divine council function as a witness, Job 16:19, a vindicator, Job 19:25, a mediator, Job 33:23 and 24, an intercessor, Isaiah 53:11 and 12, Hebrews 7:25, and an advocate before God, Daniel 7:13, Daniel 7:27. In these Old Testament passages, the council convenes before divine actions are taken, suggesting that its primary function is executive or judicial decision-making. The council passes judgment within the context of the covenant, and on that basis, a verdict is followed by subsequent actions. I'll just stop there. Again, we've talked before, and I talked about this in Unseen Realm, about there are certainly some passages where you see divine council participation in the decision-making process of God. And in other places, it's nuanced a different way, that the council carries out a decision made. In 1 Kings 22, again, this is a classic text, 1 Kings 22, 19 through 23, it's time for Ahab to die. God has already decreed, that Ahab needs to go. And so, the council is called together, and God says, hey, how are we going to do that? Let's hear what you propose. So he lets them participate. And then, the spirits, go back and forth, and the spirit steps forward. So I got a great idea. I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets. And God says, yep, that'll work. I know Ahab pretty well. That he's going to be toast, when you try that on him. So, there's this participatory element. So I wanted to read that paragraph specifically, even though it's a summary, it doesn't get into the nuts and bolts, so that, again, this audience knows that when you hear this kind of stuff about a divine council and participating in God's, judgment and working for God, and again, God allowing them, again, some input, this kind of thing. It's not just crazy Mike, okay? It's not that Heiser guy. This is just mainstream scholarship, okay? This is Old Testament scholarship. I'm just letting you know it's there. And again, in Unseen Realm, it becomes part of Unseen Realm. This is what I do in Unseen Realm is try to make biblical scholarship about, the flow of biblical theology decipherable and digestible to, normal people who aren't going to go out and get degrees, but they already know that the way scholars talk and think about the scriptures is a lot different than what you hear in church. Okay, so we're filling in lots of gaps here, and I'm exposing you. My views on things are not idiosyncratic. This is why I clutter my books with resource references, footnotes, okay? I do that for a reason, because I want you to know this other work is out there. You just didn't know it was out there. Here's where to find it. Buy the book, get the journal article, whatever it is, and away you go. I want to sort of empower the audience to do the research. So I wanted to include that passage, about, Dean's study here. What Dean does from that point on is he has like a mini commentary on Revelation 4 and 5 in his dissertation, again, from the divine council perspective. So let's just move on a little bit here. Davis, again, R. Dean Davis, again, is the one that focuses on council a lot. And also the third dissertation source, Kenske's dissertation, they have chapters in their respective dissertations overviewing sort of how the heavenly court or the heavenly council works. Like some of, and again, some of it's speculative. Kenske takes how can I describe her? Bandy's an evangelical. Davis is in the Adventist context. Kenske is Jewish, but I think her writing's a little bit more cynical too. But it's still really good stuff. Lots of good data. But they, every writer sort of has to. They go off on trajectories and speculate here and there about how the council would actually work or not. But Davis and Kenske both attempt to do this, and I'm going to give you a little sample of what Kenske says here and try to read between the lines a little bit, because I actually kind of like, what she does in the beginning of her dissertation here. She says, throughout the Hebrew Bible, there are images of God holding trial and acting in a judicial capacity. Sometimes these images appear in narrative presentations, such as the visions of Micaiah bar Imlah, it's 1 Kings 22, Zechariah 3, and the prologue to Job, Job 1 and 2. At other points, as in Psalm 50, the framework is poetic, leaving the reader to fill out the narrative setting. Still, other texts are legal in nature and imagine God's courtroom not only as occurring in some heavenly realm, but also as intersecting with the human courtroom on the ground. All these texts bear witness to the flexibility of this scene for different rhetorical and religious purposes. Sometimes the courtroom imagery is found for purposes of consolation, and comfort, and hope. At other points, the courtroom framework is used to provoke shame or regret and repentance. Often these reasons coincide, as more than one is intended at any given moment. Then I'll skip a little bit. The divine courtroom in the Hebrew Bible is not always visible to the naked eye. Often the texts which become most central to later interpreters, even later interpreters within the canon itself, are not prima facie instances of the divine courtroom. Only an understanding of the divine courtroom as a deeply ingrained feature of the religious imagination of ancient Israel can reveal the importance of these texts. Then she gives an example. One such example occurs on Mount Sinai. Having displayed extraordinary boldness before God, advocating for Israel after the golden calf, Moses insists that God show him his ways, so that he may know him. Exodus 33:13. The request to know your ways, quote unquote, is nothing less than a desire to penetrate the workings of the divine mind and to understand the process of divine decision-making, to perceive how God functions. And she goes on and talks about God's response to Moses and whatnot. Again, I use the word, maybe she's a little bit cynical in places, because I think she, well, on the one, let me put it this way. I'll just kind of summarize my thought here. On one hand, it's true that God's decisions and actions can be perceived by the reader as being unjust or a bit nasty. Okay, that's true on the surface, but in the context of covenant violation, it's really hard, again, for me to say that God is being unjust, because essentially they had fair warning here, So, she riffs on that sometimes, and I think a little bit too negatively. Again, she drifts into what she perceives as some moral ambiguities about God's decision making and so on and so forth. But again, it's kind of I don't want to call it a secular reading. I mean, because she's Jewish, and I can't make any other assumptions beyond that. But maybe she's filtering a little bit of this through the Jewish experience and whatnot. I don't know. It's a good dissertation. There's a lot of good material here, good data, and it's wonderful that she's paying attention, to this whole theme. But if you read all three of these, hers is going to feel a little bit different. Again, because of the way she takes certain things about what God is doing or God's behavior, so to speak, in the courtroom. Stacking the deck against the one under trial. Well, okay, if God really knows the heart, well then, is that the proper way to characterize God, as stacking the deck? God either knows or he doesn't, and his knowledge of the person or the people is not going to be fallible. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in case we have people go out and read either hers or all three of them. This one's going to feel a little bit different, but it's pretty thorough, in terms of the passages that pertain. And what I just read there, she says, look, if you know the court setting, if you know how ingrained this was in the religious and cultural understanding of people in ancient Israel, you're going to read other passages where a courtroom setting is not spelled out, and you'll just sense that's what's going on. So she, her dissertation, I think, is pretty thorough and well worth having as a resource. She has sections on God as judge, handing down decisions. She gets into covenants there. For instance, this is unique to her. You're not going to find this in the other two. She has commentary about the use of divination and mediators like the Urim and the Thummim and the high priest. How they function in God's decision making. Capacities. She talks about there's a hope of individuals in certain passages that are on trial, whether it's the Israelites or some specific person, that they hope that God will not be impartial. They don't want God to be impartial. They want him to favor Israel versus the nations, for example. So, she'll say, well, is that really fair? Well, yeah, it is. It is fair. Again, based upon all the history that's gone before this, she has a lot of these little rabbit trails that are just kind of interesting. She has a section on how God is to be approached. And here she gets into Abraham and Moses about how they negotiate with God in regard to a decision. Again, she sees in these scenes, let's just use those as an example, Abraham and Moses. She sees not only what's happening on the ground, okay, as this is God's divine decision making, and then Moses and Abraham, they're allowed to dicker with God and negotiate and whatnot. But she will say, by analogy, this also happens in the divine council, or you actually have here, because you also have two other witnesses, these two angels, okay, that in the scene with Abraham anyway, and you could argue by extension the one with Moses, whether it's it's not just the burning bush, it's the whole scene at Sinai where the law is given by the hand of angels. I mean, there are other witnesses here. She's saying, when Moses has these conversations with God and when Abraham has these conversations with God, they're actually part of the courtroom scene. They're actually part of the council decision, looping humans in. Again, that's unique to her dissertation. So this is why I say it's pretty thorough. It's very interesting. But again, it's going to be different than the other two. So anyway, on page 37, she gets into what this is Hebrew terminology, the reeve, that's R-I-B, but you'd pronounce it reeve like it's R-I-V. The reeve pattern. Reeve is the word for dispute or lawsuit or quarrel or any one of those. This is the covenant lawsuit idea, the reeve pattern, the reeve genre. And she writes this: one of the most important ways in which the divine courtroom appears in the Hebrew Bible is through its invocation of the so-called prophetic lawsuit or reeve pattern form of prophetic speech. Throughout the prophetic literature, the prophets indict the people of Israel for various crimes against God, all of which ultimately lead up to the breach of covenant. For the prophets, this justifies God's intention to punish the people for their misdeeds. This form of prophetic address, therefore, is an explanation of why God's actions are just. The prophets use the legal language as a means of expressing God's formal complaints and rights as a litigant, an injured party, and show through the mechanisms of human justice how God's actions are themselves functions of divine justice, even though on the surface they may not seem so. Now, she uses as a template example Micah 6, 1 through 8. I'm not going to read it because I'm just going to give you the sort of the bullet points here. You'll get some translation here. I'm not sure this is Kenske's own translation or if she's using maybe the JPS Torah translation. I don't know. But she's going to go through Micah 6:8, where Micah indicts the southern kingdom of Judah for social injustice and ethical improprieties. Now, this isn't a divine council scene, but this gives you the elements of a typical courtroom scene where God is putting Israel on trial, in this case, putting the southern kingdom, Judah, on trial, and sort of how these scenes function. So this is pages 37 and 38 in her dissertation. Hear what Yahweh is saying. Arise, contend with the mountains. Now, the word contend there is reeve. Okay, so it's a legal term. So when you see that as an Israelite, a Hebrew reader, okay, this is a lawsuit. This is lawsuit terminology. God's going to bring a case here. Arise, contend with the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, mountains, the case, reeve, of Yahweh, and everlasting foundations of the earth. For Yahweh has a case against his people. He has a reeve, there it is again, against his people, and he will reprove his people. My people, what have I done to you, and with what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you out from the land of Egypt, and from the house of slavery I redeemed you. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, the king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him. From Shittim to Gilgal, in order to know the justices of Yahweh. How shall I come before Yahweh? Bow down before the God of heights. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? This is the prophet's voice now. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with year-old calves? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my belly for the sin of my soul? He has told you, man, what is good, and what does Yahweh seek from you but to do justice, to love chesed, and humbly walk with your God. So we have a case, there's charges given by Yahweh against the people. Like, I haven't done bad things to you, and I've done all these good things to you. And again, in the context, Micah 6, we have all these abuses happening in Judah. And so it's like, what does God really want? What does God consider just? I mean, what's he really after here? Does he want you to bring sacrifices and bow down with calves and your firstborn and rams? And no. What he wants, he's told you what to do, what is good. To do justice, to love chesed, this loving loyalty idea, and to walk humbly with your God. So Micah 6, 1-8 lays out this case against the people. It's done with legal language. So the language used in here, in the Israelite context, this was courtroom jargon, okay? And you've seen court cases on TV, or whether it's fictional portrayals or something else. That how things get discussed in a court of law are different than just a normal conversation. Well, when you hit again the terminology used here, the reader will instantly know Judah's on trial. And the point here is that this language and the trappings of the scene, the prosecutorial stance, the witness is called, to bear witness against whoever's the defendant for their crimes and all this stuff. Sometimes these sorts of settings occur specifically in, divine council scenes where God is enthroned in his, heavenly temple, his house. Okay, this is where the divine council meets, all that stuff. So these elements again play out in a lot of these scenes where God is, prosecutor and judge, in some cases even jury. Divine council members play different roles. And I'm going to go back to Davis here. Davis, again, summarizes some of this. He says, an examination of the activities of the members of the divine council reveals that they fulfill several different functions, including some specific roles. They surround the head of the council as attendants, 1 Kings 22:19, Ezekiel 1:12-14, Daniel 7:10. Again, Daniel 7 is a big deal here. And I want you to hold on to that from this point forward, because Daniel 7 is going to be the backdrop, specifically the passage that John uses when he writes Revelation 4 and 5. Daniel 7 is a divine council scene. Daniel 7, 9, 10, really 9-13. That's why Revelation 4 and 5 is very clearly a divine council courtroom scene. All right? Back to Dean. It says, again, the council members support the divine throne for the head of the council. And he gives various references. I'm not just going to list out all the references here. They praise and adore the head of the council. Job 38 is a classic. Psalm 29, 1-2. Psalm 89, 5-6. Again, this is all divine council stuff. Isaiah 6:3. They participate in the council proceedings. 1 Kings 22:20. They give counsel. Isaiah 44:26. They're there to promote justice among the peoples. Psalm 82. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And serve as guardians or watchers. Daniel 4. And several references in there. After the council decision has been made and announced, they serve as messengers of the decision. Exodus 14:19, Numbers 22:31, 1 Kings 22:21-22, Isaiah 6, 8-9. Individually, Gabriel appears to be a specially named messenger in some of these contexts. Daniel 8:16, for instance. A special role appears to be taken by one who is an intercessor, witness, or advocate for the faithful on earth before the head of the council. He brings up Psalm 89 here, which we've talked about before on the podcast. In Daniel 7:13 and 14, the one like a son of man appears to serve as the witness or intercessor on behalf of the saints, the holy ones of the Most High, and the people of the saints of the Most High. Daniel 7:25-27. And from that point on, Dean quotes Mullen's classic study of the Divine Council. Again, this is from Mullen's book, page 228. It's very hard to find this, but you can get it. You can still find it in PDF here and there. Theodore Mullen writes, in Hebrew thought, Yahweh functions as both prosecutor and judge when a negative judgment is rendered. in the infrequent Old Testament divine reeve lawsuit context. Again, Mullen's all over the same set of information. I'm not going to read it because it's repetitious. And Davis goes through Mullen's work, and then he observes that in all major council scenes, all the big ones, the ones that are most familiar, 1 Kings 22, Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1 through 11, and Daniel 7, all of them have the head of the council seated on a throne. God, the king judge, is attended to by various members of the heavenly host. And sometimes those members, at least some of them, are also seated. Daniel 7, the thrones were placed, plural. Isaiah and Ezekiel situate the throne inside the temple. So there's a temple setting implied for these judgment scenes. The temple, of course, is where God abides and the place from which he rules, so that makes sense. There is evidence, Daniel 4, Daniel 7, 1 Kings 22, of participation in decision-making in council, so on and so forth. Now, what Bandy's going to do, again, he goes through, Dean's work and some of this other stuff and so on and so forth. What Bandy's going to do is say, okay, if you have all that in your head, and you look at Revelation 4 and 5, you're going to notice some things right away. He summarizes the parallels, and so I'm going to use his summary to sort of head towards setting up the next episode here for us. He writes on this is pages 44 and 45. Again, if you go get his dissertation, he says, first, God is described as the head of the divine council in terms drawn directly from the Old Testament. You look at how God is described in Revelation 4 and 5. It's going to come out of the Old Testament in these scenes. Second, the 24 elders function in a capacity similar to the divine council in the Old Testament. And he actually cites here Isaiah 24:23, Yahweh, among his elders. In Israel, elders traditionally served as community leaders or royal officials who participated in council sessions and sat as judges. Third, Davis contends that other beings like the seven spirits of God, the four living creatures, John, a strong angel, the Lamb, the myriad of angels, all these characters, even every creature in the cosmos could all be classified as members of the divine council in these scenes. Okay. Fourth, the issue before the council is the worthiness of the Lamb to open the sealed scroll. The final evidence that Davis cites is that of the judicial nature of the scroll itself. He states that the seals were used to provide legal validity to the document that Davis maintains is the Lamb's Book of Life. Now, that's Davis's interpretation of the scroll. But again, you get this courtroom trapping sort of feel, this context. Bandy, again, he's very positive of what Davis is writing. He tweaks it here and there because what he's going to do in his own work is sort of improve the council elements here. The fourth chapter of Bandy's dissertation is entitled An Exegetical Survey of the Prophetic Lawsuit in the Second Vision of Revelation. It's Revelation 4:1 through 16:21. So he takes it all the way to chapter 16, chapters 4 through 16. We're only focused here, at least at this point, on Revelation 4 and 5. So I want to get into, again, some of the things in 4 and 5 here just to set up. But I can't exclude what Bandy writes about the first three chapters. We've already been through the first three chapters, and we've done this drill down thing. But now that we're at chapters 4 and 5, there's stuff in Revelation 1 through 3 that contributes to or is in some way involved with this covenant lawsuit, divine council, courtroom thing that you're going to get hit in the face with, when you get out of chapter 3 and into chapter 4. So Bandy summarizes it this way. He says, the letters to the seven churches constitute lawsuit speeches whereby Jesus conducts a forensic examination of his covenant people. Let me just think about the content of Revelation 1 through 3. These letters to the churches, okay? Back to Bandy. He says, the form of the letters generally distinguishes them as prophetic oracles, similar to the Old Testament prophets, and more specifically, as covenant lawsuit speeches. As such, the book of Revelation follows the pattern of the Old Testament prophetic lawsuit that begins with the people of God. The judgments and promises announced for the churches in the seven letters remain contingent upon what they do in response to these oracles. In this sense, the remaining vision, especially the interludes, relates to how the churches respond. In other words, whether they faithfully endure as witnesses during the heightened state of persecution. Once the Lord deals with his people, he turns his attention to the surrounding nations with oracles of judgment. This pattern is established by the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. There's Deuteronomy 32 again. Once the covenant people repent and obey, Yahweh promises to exact vengeance on Israel's pagan enemies. That's actually a reference to Deuteronomy 32:43. If you read through Deuteronomy 32, I'm just going to break in here. We get verses 8 and 9, which this audience knows well, the disinheritance of the nations, and Yahweh takes Israel as his own, okay? But then you keep reading all the way up to like verse 17, when they worship the Shadim, quote unquote demons, they worship, gods that they had not known. Deuteronomy 32 shifts from the Babel event to an indictment of Israel for apostasy as you keep reading. And what Bandy's saying is, look, this notion of, like in the book of Revelation, you get these oracles, these letters to the churches, where the people of God are being evaluated and judged, and in some cases commended. Okay? And that's going to carry all the way through the rest of the book of Revelation. How do God's people respond to what happens in the first 3 chapters, these letters? Do they hold fast under persecution? Do they refuse, again, to be disloyal, to Yahweh? I mean, all these different sort of themes. And then once God's people get dealt with, then all of a sudden the attention in the book of Revelation shifts to the judgment of the nations. And of course, at the end, the nations are going to be, God is going to, there's going to be healing of the nations ultimately. Okay, so if you know the whole flow here. And if you go to Deuteronomy 32 again, it begins, with here's the way the situation was with Israel, and then Israel apostatized, and then God deals with Israel, and then eventually you get to verse 43 in Deuteronomy 32, where God is taking revenge against the gods, okay, gods of the nations, and so on and so forth. So Bandy's saying, this is the pattern of Deuteronomy 32. It just, this is the lawsuit of Deuteronomy 32, and it's played out. It's tracked on in the book of Revelation. So back to Bandy, he says the book of Revelation likewise sounds similar note of judgment pertaining to the churches, but then the remaining contents of the vision pertains to the judgment of the nations. Significantly, the judgment of the nations is closely tied to the theme of revenge, vengeance for their treatment of the saints, which is, again, Deuteronomy 32:43. So I would summarize it this way. In essence, Revelation 1 through 3 is both a lawsuit dealing with the followers of Jesus. They get warnings, and in some cases indictment, and again, they get commended as well. It's a lawsuit, kind of a courtroom drama, a courtroom evaluation of the followers of Jesus. But at the same time, it's also building a case against the nations, because some of the churches that are the recipients of the letters have been faithful. They have endured under persecution, and they're suffering at the hands of the nations. So it's both evaluative, and all of that testimony is going to be used later to indict the nations. Now, Beale and Carson, if you think, I don't know, it's I'm not sure about Revelation 4 and 5 and all this divine counsel stuff. Okay, let's go to some familiar evangelical voices here, other than me. Beale and Carson's commentary on the Old Testament used in the New Testament lays this out in 14 steps. Okay. They lay it out. They lay out the courtroom setting of Revelation 4 and 5 really nicely. Basically, they move from the divine council courtroom scene in Daniel 7 over to Revelation 4 and 5. So here's what they write. An overview of the 2 chapters together, in Revelation 4 and 5, reveals that they exhibit a unified structure that corresponds to the structure of Daniel 7. It corresponds more to the structure of Daniel 7 than any other vision of the Old Testament. If we begin with Daniel 7, 9 through 28, and observe the elements, in that passage, and the order of their presentation in that passage, if we look at all that and say, well, what about Daniel 7, 9 through 28 is in common with Revelation 45? This is their words. A striking resemblance is discernible. I'm just going to go through the list. 1, introductory vision phraseology. Daniel 7, align Daniel 7, verse 9, and then they loop in verse 2 and verses 6 and 7 with Revelation 4:1. It's going to look a lot alike. Setting of the thrones, or thrones in heaven, Daniel 7:9a, Revelation 4:2a, and 4:4a. God sitting on a throne, Daniel 7:9b, Revelation 4:2b. Description of God's appearance on the throne. John even borrows the description. You have Daniel 7:9c and Revelation 4:3a. Fire before the throne, Daniel 7:9 and 10, Revelation 4:5. Heavenly servants surrounding the throne, Daniel 7:10b, Revelation 4:4b, so on and so forth. I mean, maybe it's a little too much detail, but 14 specific parallels between Daniel 7. When we do the transcript, we'll just include the rest of them. But there are 14 specific parallels between Daniel 7 and Revelation 4 and 5, and they're in the same order. It's completely obvious, A, that Daniel 7 is a divine council scene, and B, John is riffing off of it in Revelation 4 and 5. He could not be any more explicit and detailed and thorough in the alignment. And Daniel 7, again, is a courtroom scene. It is part of this covenant lawsuit thing going on. In Daniel 7's case, of course, the four beasts, the nations are going to be judged. That they're the ones sitting under the under indictment. Okay, in that scene. Here again, you're going to have Daniel 7 also loops into people of God too, but here you're going to have in I'll just pull out number 10 here, Beal and Carson. There's a reference to the kingdom, which includes all peoples, nations, and tongues. It's not just Israel. Okay, so you have, it's this full orb thing. The kingdom of that is talked about in Daniel 7 isn't just the kingdom of Israel. Okay, the Son of Man is Lord of the nations. And over in Revelation 4:5, the nations are going to be in view too. You're going to have both believers. Are they enduring? Are they holding up? Are they sustaining their belief, their faith? And what about the nations? We are nearing, we are approaching. We're really in the process of the nations now coming under judgment. So you get the whole mix. It's very deliberate tracking between Revelation 4:5 and Daniel 7. Just on and on and on it goes. I think that's actually a good place to stop. And it's a good setup for part 2, our next episode, because we can just conclude it this way. There is a solid consensus of scholarship, and there is an indisputable relationship between Revelation 4:5 and Daniel 7. And Daniel 7 is firmly part of what we call the covenant lawsuit genre in the Old Testament, this divine, and even more specifically, a divine council lawsuit scenes. Daniel 7 is right smack dab in the middle of that. It is a classic example, and Revelation 4 and 5 uses it 14 points, even in order. It's unmistakable. So there's a solid consensus of scholarship and data here that utilize all of this stuff. Again, this is the Old Testament context for the larger picture of Revelation 4 and 5. And with that as a backdrop, when we return in the next episode, we're going to drill down. We're going to start to drill down. I may be able to cover Revelation 4 in one more episode. We'll see. Once I get my head into the material, maybe we'd have a part 3. I don't know yet. But we're going to be reading Revelation 4 against the backdrop of a divine council courtroom. Okay. And then within that, John is going to be bringing other Old Testament data in to articulate specific things, specific points, and illustrate specific things and specific points. So John has set the table. His readers know, if they know Daniel 7, which is a really fundamentally important passage, okay? If they know Daniel 7, they know just what the scene is in Revelation 4 and 5. And they're going to be reading with John this court proceeding. And as John goes through the courtroom drama, he's going to be drawing in other things to make the case and explain what's going on, or what's going, the things that are, the things that are going to happen, and so on and so forth.
We're doing part 2, and we're going to have 3 parts of Revelation 4. We got lots to talk about here.
Hopefully it won't be 4 parts. We'll try to get it in a third next time. But yeah, here we are. It's just there's just so much going on related to the Old Testament, in these chapters. So I don't want to just arbitrarily skip something just for the sake of, not doing a separate part. So here we are. But we might as well just jump in here. We should probably say something about part one. If somebody's just jumping in here, you probably need to go listen to part one before you hit this one. Although, maybe I can summarize things. Last time we closed with some material from Alan Bandy. Basically, the focus of part one was how Revelation 4 and 5 repurposes something called the covenant lawsuit genre of the Old Testament, which is a fancy way of saying you have these scenes in the Old Testament that are courtroom scenes, and you have certain courtroom scenes that just involve people. That's actually the minority, though. Usually it's God sort of in a courtroom setting or with courtroom language, and there's a technical term for this, the reeve. That means it's a Hebrew term for lawsuit or quarrel or contention or something like that, debate. You'd have God bringing a reeve, a lawsuit against his people for violating the covenant. So there's a bunch of these where, God is the judge and the jury and the prosecutor, either all those parts or the majority of them. And in some of those, that courtroom is set with the divine council. It's a heavenly courtroom. You have witnesses there, members of the heavenly host that are part of the proceedings. So this is the backdrop to Revelation 4 and 5. Bandy, I'll just take a little slice of what we closed with him. He says, the letters to the seven churches constitute lawsuit speeches whereby Jesus conducts a forensic examination of his covenant people. So even in the first three chapters, you have this sort of lawsuit or courtroom kind of challenge where there's an indictment being issued. And do the people that are being spoken to, do they do well? Are they vindicated, or do they have something to change or to fix here? Bandy says the form of the letters generally distinguishes them as prophetic oracles similar to the Old Testament prophets. So again, these letters themselves pattern themselves after things that you'll find in the prophets. And then he goes on and he says the book of Revelation generally follows the pattern of the Old Testament prophetic lawsuit that begins with the people of God. You have judgments and promises announced for the churches in the seven letters, and they remain contingent upon what they do in response to those oracles. So he describes this a little bit, but he makes the point toward the end of this quotation that we ended part one with, that the first three chapters you have this dialogue between Jesus, the one thtelling John to write, the exalted Ancient of Days, Son of Man figure, okay. And it sounds like that's the only thing happening in the dialogue. But later, Bandy points out that the proceedings here and the content of some of these things, is going to be transferred over or carry over into an indictment of the nations. Not God's people per se, but their enemies as well. And so that's where Revelation is going to be heading. So Bandy says, look, that this covenant lawsuit thing begins with the letters to the churches. And it's going to be found throughout the book. But Revelation 4 and 5 is really sort of the big one. And I mentioned at the end of the last episode, Beale and Carson. It was actually Beale and I think McDonough, the ones who actually wrote this part of that Old Testament in the New Testament commentary that's edited by Beale and Carson. They look at Daniel 7, which is a very famous and indisputable divine council, divine courtroom scene. And there are 14 features of Daniel 7 that occur in Revelation 4 and 5 in the same order. So it's very clear that John is tracking on Daniel 7. And I'm going to use that as a segue because I didn't quote this in the first episode, but one of the other sources that I introduced to the audience in the introductory episode to this series, which is the use of the Old Testament Revelation, by Steve, again, I always wonder if I pronounce his name correctly, Moyes, that's Moyise. And his book is The Old Testament in the Book of Revelation. It's an edited volume. He actually, references Daniel 7 too, and he has a chart in his book, actually a series of charts where he'll map over parts of Daniel 7 over to Revelation 4. So I'm just going to give a few examples here in the first 10 verses of Revelation 4. What parts of Daniel 7 show up? Well, in Revelation 4:2a, the first part of the verse, that references throne in heaven, which is Daniel 7:9a. 4:2b references God on the throne. That's 7:9b. And Revelation 4:3a, the first part of 4:3, you have an appearance of the deity, appearance of God. It's also Daniel 7:9. Again, third part of that verse. Revelation 4:5, you have fire before the throne. And again, that's in Daniel 7:9 and 10. You have throne attendants. Again, here you get in the heavenly host language in Revelation 4:4b, and then 6 through 10. Again, that's Daniel 7, second part of that verse. So you could track all the way through Revelation 4 and 5 and find these elements from Daniel 7. It's very easy. Now, for what we're going to do in this part, we need to add some things because we're going to go in a few different directions here. But again, tied back into these scenes, the divine council courtroom scenes. To these items in Daniel 7, it could be added when you get into Revelation 4, Ezekiel 1 cherubim imagery, and Isaiah 6 seraphim imagery. You get fire again, which you could go to Isaiah 6 and see that. You go to Ezekiel 1 and see that. Okay, what will become evident is that John is effectively casting the throne room scene in Revelation 4 and 5 with elements from Daniel 7 and Ezekiel 1 and Isaiah 6, 3 divine council scenes. And each one of those scenes reinforces, again, the idea of God's sovereign rule and his oversight. He is ultimately the judge of all things. And that's going to be a theme that will emerge in Revelation 4 pretty quickly. But I'm going to read, for the sake of our episode here, I'm going to read a few verses from Revelation 4 so that you can sort of mentally go back and catch some of these images. Again, in these three major passages, Daniel 7, Ezekiel 1, Isaiah 6. There's going to be others, but those are the three main ones, and they're all divine council scenes. So why don't I'll just start in verse 1 here again, and we'll read maybe through verse 10. Again, some of these things we've talked about a little bit before. You're going to hear references to white garments and crowns, and we had those in earlier chapters of Revelation and earlier episodes, but a lot of new stuff here. So John writes, "After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, and rumblings, and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass, like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. And day and night they never cease to say, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.' And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. And they cast their crowns before the throne, saying, 'Worthy are you, O Lord and God, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created.'" So that's actually the entirety of chapter 4. We won't go into chapter 5, but you can see right away, how parts of Ezekiel 1, parts of Isaiah 6, of course, we've already tracked, with the Daniel 7 thing in the last episode a little bit here. You have an amalgamation of very obvious and noteworthy divine throne room, divine council scenes, God with his attendants and so on and so forth. Of course, Daniel 7 is really capturing a courtroom imagery because it uses, it has references to multiple thrones being there. The court sat and the books were opened, again, Daniel 7. So the context for this is pretty clear. And these all are going to provide some input into how we parse some of the elements here in chapter 4. So let's just start in verse 1. We'll work our way through as to what's going on here. Again, it's not only these three passages, but there's going to be some others here, but these are the primary ones. Now, as we do this, just think about, and for people in this audience who are familiar with Unseen Realm, my book, I mean, you're a lot of this you've already probably mentally looped in because, heavenly courtroom, heavenly throne room, well, those aren't really separable from where God, lives, his house, these sorts of images, because they all tend to overlap in Old Testament thought. And if you can sort of, remember that point, then you could ask yourself, well, where else does God live? In the Old Testament, well, he lives in mountains and gardens, and, cosmic mountain is a big theme in Unseen Realm. We're gonna draw on all of that here. So Revelation 4:1, the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet. Let me just stop right there. I'm going to take a little bit of a rabbit trail, and I'm going to do a little bit of end times systems here, just a spasm. Just a note. It does not say, the verse does not say that a trumpet sounded. It's not what it says. A voice. He hears a voice speaking to him, and the voice sounds like a trumpet. Okay, it's not a trumpet, it's a voice. So we must be talking about something like volume here, something really loud. That's the point. And this has an Old Testament, precedent, which we'll get to in a moment. The text clearly has John hearing a voice that came to him like a trumpet. It has some point of similarity to a trumpet. It's not a trumpet, just some point of similarity. So the verse actually provides no connection to presumed rapture passages. I mean, other passages in the New Testament that people are either going to interpret as a rapture or second coming or something else. It doesn't really have a specific connection when it's just a trumpet, because this is a voice. Now, another sidebar. Those who hold to a pre-trib rapture add this thought to Revelation 4, verse 1. They say, well, this must be the rapture, again, because they're on one hand they're thinking trumpet, but they're going to add this. This must be the rapture because the church, they argue, is absent from the rest of the book. In other words, what they mean by that is that the word translated church, ecclesia, does not appear in the rest of the book of Revelation. That's actually a little bit of careless thinking. While, ecclesia does not occur the rest of the way, guess what does occur? The term holy ones, hagioi, it gets translated saints in the New Testament. That occurs 13 times. And that is a frequent designation of the church elsewhere in the New Testament, like Paul's letters. So it's really a misguided thought to say, well, after Revelation 4:1, with this trumpet, the church is gone, so this must indicate the rapture, the church is taken off the earth. Well, no. The fact that ecclesia doesn't occur doesn't mean anything, because hagioi, holy ones, saints, occurs 13 times. So that's not a good argument for that. I mean, if you're going to adopt a pre-trib rapture position, you need to rely on something else other than this, because that's really a terrible argument. It's something explicitly contradicted by the text later on. Lastly, I would say this is the same voice trumpet language we find in Revelation 1:10. Let's go back to Revelation 1:10. Again, just a suggestion here. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. It's the same language that we just read in Revelation 4. I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna and to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. Keep reading. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw, here you get the 7 golden lampstands. In the midst of the lampstand, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe. And then you get the Ancient of Days image. I mean, this is the deity Christ figure. That's whose voice this is. So if you go to 1:10 when you're in 4:1 and think about there, think about, well, what's the possible relationship here? back in 110, you have the same thing. We don't have a rapture there. So why would we have a rapture in 4:1? And of course, the argument is going to be circular here. Well, we don't have a rapture in 110 because the churches are being addressed. There's still the church on earth. And again, the assumption being the church is off earth after chapter 4, verse 1, which is not true because Holy Ones again appears 13 times later on. So again, I wanted to get that spasm out because you do have an Old Testament image here, but it has no relationship. I mean, the point of the image does nothing to prop up a specific point of a specific system of end times thinking. Again, that's not the direction it goes. So before getting into where it does come from the Old Testament, I think we needed to say something there. So let's get away from the eschatological systems and go to the text. I think that's a good idea. That's what we try to do here. So On, in his Revelation commentary, writes of the trumpet metaphor, and he's going to loop in some things here, and you'll see what we're angling for. He says that a number of different metaphors are used in Revelation to capture the loudness of the voices heard by John. The sound of these voices is compared to the blast of a trumpet, as here. It's also compared to the sound of thunder, to the sound of roaring water. The sound of a trumpet or shofar was part of the Sinai theophany, according to Exodus 19:16 and Exodus 20:18. Again, what's happening in Exodus 19 and 20? It's the encounter with God on Mount Sinai after the Exodus when they're going to receive the law and of course, enter into the covenant with God. So back to On, he says, the motif of the sound of the trumpet continued to be used in theophanic contexts, theophanies. You'd often get this language when there's a theophany in view or in the context. Let me give some examples. Isaiah 18:3, Joel 2:1, Zechariah 9:14, for instance. He said, you also see it used in the Israelite cult, that is, during certain rituals or certain festival events. 2 Samuel 6:15, Isaiah 27:13, Joel 2:15, and so on. The use of the shofar in cultic settings could therefore be considered an imitation of the voice of Yahweh. I think that's an interesting point. Let me just stop there for a moment. Why would they use trumpets, at certain rituals associated with the temple or the gathering of the people? Because that was designed to make people think of the voice of God at Sinai that sounded like a trumpet in terms of its volumes. That was the way they imitated it or mimicked it. Again, to call to their minds a recollection of, hey, we're Israel, and hey, God entered into covenant with us, and hey, there's this thing, the law that we should be following. Again, it was all designed to take the people back, to sort of set the scene or remind them of the original, context for this stuff, which was, their, God making them anew and entering into this covenant at Sinai. So again, I thought that was kind of interesting. He adds a point here. He says the voice of Athena in Greco-Roman religious texts is compared to a trumpet in the introductory theophanic scene in Sophocles, his writings Ajax, number 17. And thunder is called the trumpet of Zeus, in another text. So you probably most definitely have a hearkening back to Sinai, with this trumpet. In other words, the point is not that the voice in Revelation 4 is calling people back into the old covenant. This is Jesus. Okay, this is the Son of Man, the risen Son of Man, who is portrayed also as the Ancient of Days in Revelation 1. This is the risen Christ, okay, the Lord, the one on the throne. And he's not saying, all that new covenant stuff that I accomplished on the cross and through my resurrection and ascension, let's forget about all that and go back to the law. That's not the point. The point is that God is speaking. That's why the trumpet imagery is used. And if you're Greco-Roman and you're thinking of Athena and Zeus, it's like, no, that isn't the voice here to pay attention to. It's the God of Israel. It's the risen Christ, who is God in the flesh, who was and is to come. Okay? This is the voice of Christ the Lord, who is God, who is identified with God. That's what the trumpet imagery serves to do, to put people on alert as to whose voice this actually is. This is Jesus speaking as God and with the authority of God. He is God's word. Okay, so just as God's word to Moses at Sinai was precipitated by the sound of a trumpet, okay, from the glory cloud. It's Exodus 19:13, 19:16, 19:19, Exodus 20:18. I mean, it happens several times there. You get this trumpet sound from the glory cloud, and it is precipitating the dialogue that God has with Moses. Okay, just as it announces that. Okay, this is supposed to take our minds back, and since in 1:10 again, it's the resurrected Christ who is alive forevermore, who has the keys, to death and Hades, all the stuff we've covered before. He is the one who's going to judge the living and the dead. All this. Listen up. Okay, this is the word of God. That's the whole point. It's not terribly complicated, and you miss all of that if you see the word trumpet and you think, oh, that's the rapture. No, it actually isn't. And if you're going to take that position in terms of end time stuff, you really need to go somewhere else. This is not a good support for it. Let's move on to verses 2 and 3. John writes, "At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, with one seated on the throne. He who sat there had the appearance of jasper," the Greek is iaspis, "and carnelian," the Greek is sardion. "And around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald," that's smaragdinos. Again, the throne and its occupant are pretty obvious, as is their correlation with Daniel 7, Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1. 1 Kings 22, we could throw that in there. It's a famous divine council scene. Again, all the stuff we talked about in part 1. I want to spend a little time, though, on the gemstones. That's new information. The first two are also found in descriptions of the New Jerusalem, which is the dwelling place of God and his council, and of course believers in the end, okay, the end of the story, which would make sense because we have a throne in heaven. Where would we expect the throne to be? Well, God's house. Okay, that no surprise there. They're also used in the Septuagint, these first two terms, for the tabernacle. Again, it creates a link back into other sacred spaces, other houses of God, that sort of thing. The first one of the three is also used in the description of Eden. Okay, when Eden gets its geography in Genesis 2:12. So again, you have these connections back to other cosmic, abodes of God. Now, Owen again has some comment here about the gemstones. I'm just going to read what he has in his commentary again. "Throne scenes in Jewish apocalyptic literature do not usually use precious stones as metaphors for describing the throne of God. However, the throne vision in Ezekiel 1, it mentions several precious stones and metals." Again, Ezekiel 1, there we go again. So some of this vocabulary you'll find in Ezekiel 1. "In some angelic epiphanies," he continues, "precious stones can be used in the description. For instance, Daniel 10, 5, and 6. And that's going to describe the girdle, the body, and the legs of the angel. To a certain extent, John uses the precious stones drawn from the description of the heavenly Jerusalem in describing God and his throne. 3 precious stones are used in the throne scene and in the description of the New Jerusalem. That would be jasper, and carnelian, and crystal is another one. Sapphire, mentioned in the description of the throne in Ezekiel 1:26, occurs in Revelation only in 21:19. So again, he makes the point that we just sort of summarized before we got into his little section, that this gemstone imagery is often going to be described the place where God lives. Okay. And if you've read Unseen Realm and if you've read the Demons book, I use this very obvious fact to point out that we should not be looking at the stones in Ezekiel 28 as the stuff on the high priest's breastplate. The list does not match, but the list does match the divine abode language, specifically, in where God lives, specifically in the book of Revelation. So this Ezekiel 28, that the language there is not about the high priest, it's about the dwelling place of God, which of course in Ezekiel 28, that would make sense because the context is Eden, the garden mountain of God. Okay. So let's segue out of that. We don't want to spend any more time on Ezekiel 28. We've done that a lot on the podcast. The rainbow, let's talk about that. That also has Old Testament precedent. On comments briefly that the rainbow is based on an allusion to the throne vision in Ezekiel 1:27 and 28. So Let's read Ezekiel 1:27, because that's probably not the place that you would think about when you hear rainbow. It says here, upward from what had the appearance of his waist. This is the divine man on the throne in Ezekiel 1, the weird wheels vision. Upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him. So this is this idea of brightness around the one seated on the throne, like think of an arc. Okay, Owen says that there's possibly an allusion. This kind of language might be a reference back, again, like all this other stuff is with the gemstones, to Ezekiel 1:27 and 28. Now, for sure, John has the God and has God enthroned as a man, that vision in Ezekiel 1 in view, because we get this other vocabulary from Ezekiel 1 in Revelation 4. So, what Owen is saying is that's legit, but there's a little more to it. The Septuagint word for rainbow in Ezekiel 1:28, which is taxon, is not the word in Revelation, but the reiteration of the cherubim throne vision in Ezekiel 10 does use this word. So, again, the connection back to Ezekiel's vision is legit. That's certainly, again, arguably part of what John is doing here. We do get the terminology in the weird throne, wheels, chariot vision in chapter 10. We do get the word that John uses in Revelation 4 here in the Septuagint of Ezekiel 10. We don't get it in Ezekiel 1, but we do get it in 10. But again, the description in Ezekiel 1 about this being surrounded by brightness. Okay, if you interpret that as there's like a brightness encircling the one seated on the throne, well, okay, that could be rainbow imagery. So Ezekiel 1 is in play here. But you're probably thinking of the bow, the rainbow, as it's taken in Genesis 9:13 after the flood. This is a famously difficult passage. There's some oddities in it. I think that's also on the table. And again, this isn't unique to me, but this could also be a reference point for John, but in a different way. Maybe not so much textually as, again, a teaching point. So Beale, in his New International Greek text commentary on the book of Revelation, suggests that, quote, in general, in view of the judgments introduced by Revelation 4 and 5, there's lots of judgment going on, and later in the book too, obviously. The rainbow shows that it is important from the beginning that God bear witness that even as judge, he will be gracious to his true people, unquote. Again, like just as the rainbow was, sort of was the sign of the promise that I'm not going to destroy all the life on the earth again. So Beale's saying, well, this bow idea here, this rainbow idea might signal to the readers of Revelation it's going to be really bad, but God isn't going to destroy everyone. Okay, the righteous will be saved, and so on and so forth. It takes their minds back to the flood, Genesis, and gives them some hope as well. I think this point is expressed a little better, though, by Gallas in his study of the throne motif in Revelation. I referenced this source. I think it was last episode, but Laszlo Gallas, throne motif in the book of Revelation, that book. He writes this. He says, in Ezekiel 1:28, the divine splendor is likened to the mere appearance of a rainbow. So he's looping that in. While in Revelation 4:3, John sees a rainbow encircling the throne, which is compared to an emerald in appearance. As Bauckham concludes, so he's going to quote Bauckham here, the rainbow imagery, quote, moves from simile to reality. Though in John's vision, his throne vision, it primarily evokes the idea of God's glory, at the same time, it introduces the theme of covenant that is developed later in the book. Now just think about that. The rainbow as a theme or sign of covenant. That's essentially what Beale was talking about in referencing back to Genesis 9, because God makes a covenant with Noah. Okay? So you have the same sort of thematic overlap. This is Revelation 4. If we think in these terms, in a divine council courtroom scene that parallels Daniel 7 in over a dozen ways. In Daniel 7, It is God and his council that decrees and executes the fate of empires opposed to his people. In Revelation, God is going to judge empires as well. And John's going to use the Daniel 7 beast imagery in several passages for God's enemy. Yet the people of God are also going to be under severe persecution as things move toward a climactic end. And again, here's where your end time systems, I'll say get in the way, but they also have a way of coping with this. Your pre-trib rapture, although those are Christians saved during the tribulation, fine. If you don't have a rapture, it's just believers, okay, that are still left, suffering, sort of in the pathway of God's judgment here. So either way, this is an element. The people of God are under severe persecution as things move toward a climactic end. The heavens and earth themselves will melt away. It's an apocalypse, and people get hurt. They get harmed and killed. But the sign of the rainbow is a reminder that God will not destroy all flesh. There will be a surviving remnant. He has made a covenant to that effect and will not forget it. The council will judge rightly in the end. God's enemies will be destroyed forever, ultimately, when you get to the end of the book of Revelation, again, either into everlasting torment or annihilation. Again, we've talked about those two options in Q&As. Either one is forever. God's enemies will be destroyed forever, but his children will not. They will become citizens and rulers at the end of days in God's house, in the new Eden. So the rainbow imagery, again, has some theological importance, and it would offer to readers, hey, go back and remember, God said he would never, that it's not going to be a total annihilation. It's going to be bad, but it's not going to be total. The Lord will remember his people, even those who die. So we find out later in the book of Revelation, even those, who wind up dead are going to be raised to life, and they will not. And that isn't their death here is not the end of them. They will be raised to life, and they will live forever with the Lord in his house. So, God's going to remember his promises. He's going to remember the covenant. Now, let's read verses 4 through 8 again. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And before the throne were 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, there are 4 living creatures, full of eyes, in front and behind. First one's like a lion, second like an ox, third one like a face of a man, fourth living creature had an eagle and like an eagle in flight. Okay, so we'll just again pick up with that language that we had read earlier, and then of course we get the holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty right out of Isaiah 6. Again, the contexts here are familiar. Most of these items, though, are not only going to be familiar, but a good number of them we've already seen and already discussed in earlier episodes because they appear or were relevant back in earlier discussions. So, for instance, the white garments and the crowns, again, we discussed those earlier in relation to Revelation 2:17 and Revelation 3:4 and 5 and Revelation 3:18. So we're not going to add anything to those. Lightning and thunder take us back to the Sinai theophany, which we just commented on in relation to the trumpet sound. So again, that's repetition in that sense. We also get those storm and earthquake elements. And they're found not only here in Revelation 4 or 5, but found in other passages in Revelation, basically 4 passages in total. So Revelation 4:5, we get, from the throne came lightning and rumbling and thunder. Revelation 8:5, there's a reference to thunder and rumbling and lightning and an earthquake. Revelation 11:19, there was lightning and rumbling and thunder and an earthquake and great hail. Get the hail added. And Revelation 16:18 through 21, then there were lightning and rumbling and thunder, and there was a great earthquake and great hail. Now, On has a comment on these lists, these 4 passages. He says, there's several things we can observe about these lists. Storm phenomena form the core of all 4 lists. 2 lists in 11:19 and 16:18 through 21 are virtually identical. The theophanic use of storm phenomena. In other words, storm phenomena are often associated with the theophany, an appearance of God in the Old Testament. So these storm phenomena, such as lightning, rumblings, and thunder, grew out of the narrative of the Sinai theophany in Exodus 19:16 through 18, where 5 phenomena are actually mentioned: thunder, lightning, a thick cloud, a loud trumpet blast, and an earthquake. So again, it's pretty clear where this is going back to and where it's deriving from. In Revelation 4:5, the 7 spirits of fire identified with torches of fire. Again, you get the fire imagery at Sinai as well. Again, the dwelling place of God. To be broader about it, fire is sort of a stock element of the divine presence. I mentioned this in passing in Unseen Realm. I can't remember what chapter, but you will often see fire associated with, an appearance of God. I mean, the most obvious ones like the burning bush. Okay, that's pretty easy, but it's actually again a stock element. Owen writes here again. This is an interesting quote. Since the view is frequently found in early Judaism that angels are made of fire, it is possible that 7 angelic beings are referred to here. Again, as the allegorical interpretation in verse 5c, the last part of verse 5 makes clear. Again, and this is all part of the 7 spirits before the throne of God and the eyes of the Lord stuff that we've talked about before. Owen points out, some other people say that the 7 blazing torches represent the menorah, but again, that would take us back to Zechariah 4 anyway, and you get into the 7 spirits, the eyes of the Lord, who turn out to be supernatural beings. So again, this connection of the fire image with, again, he's using the word angels because that's sort of the throwaway word here, but again, supernatural beings around the throne, the seraphim, throne guardians, okay? That there's something really to be said for that in this language. It's not just isolated to this. He quotes a couple, passages from some pseudepigrapha text, some Second Temple material that mentions countless beings constitute a flame of fire who stand around the throne of God. So that's in the second apocalypse of Baruch, 21:6, and 4th Ezra 8:21-22 speaks of hosts of angels who stand before God's throne and at his command are changed to wind and fire, and so on and so forth. Now, again, this is a way that supernatural beings, particularly those who guard the throne, are described, in the Bible. And again, this imagery is drawn, from different places. Sometimes the context is Babylonian, sometimes the context is Egyptian. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, this is going to be familiar territory to you. If you've read the Angels book, it's going to be familiar. As I noted in Unseen Realm, those seraphim in Isaiah 6 could also likely be serpentine in appearance from the noun seraph. It just depends what does seraph come from. Is it the noun? That would be a serpent. Is it the verb, to burn? Then it would be a fiery one. Well, you can have them both if you're talking about spitting cobras, and I bring this up in the Unseen Realm, and I draw on an article by Provencal. His study of the seraph is the most extensive one, and I quote that in the Unseen Realm about this point. And it's language drawn from Egyptian religion, where spitting cobras that would has had this fiery venom, would guard the throne of the deity, and again you get the seraph idea, seraphim idea of throne guardians that protecting the sacred space of the deity from defilement and all this sort of stuff. Again, both of these things can be true. It's probably best to see the imagery here as a both and not an either or. But you actually don't need Isaiah 6 for the notion that supernatural beings can manifest as fire or be described in those terms, or that fire is a stock element of God's presence. You get those ideas in other passages like Exodus 3, burning bush, pillar of fire, Exodus wanderings, Deuteronomy 33:2, even though there's a textual issue there. We get this either a fiery law or fire associated with a multitude, of the heavenly host at Sinai giving the law. Again, I discussed that in Unseen Realm as well. You have the fact that God sends fire from heaven, Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, Psalm 104:4 says he makes his messengers winds and his ministers a flaming fire. And there's a lot of Old Testament imagery that uses fire. And again, that's not to the exclusion of serpentine imagery. It's in my view, it's a both and. It's not an either or. But this is where again this thinking sort of comes from. And look at what we have. We've got all these elements here in Revelation 4, and they can all be found with God's, presence at Sinai. And you say, well, not the serpentine thing. Well, okay, that's true, but you still get myriads of angels there. Again, just go back to Unseen Realm and read the section about where does this idea that the law was dispensed by angels come from? Okay, that's where we discussed it in the book. So you actually do have all the elements here, maybe not in every facet or from every angle, but this is very clearly an association with Sinai, because Sinai is where God lives. That doesn't mean, though, that it's not associated with Ezekiel 1, because Ezekiel 1, again, has all this imagery too, and more that you get looped into Revelation 4. Again, I'm going to stop here and remind you, this is what John does. He doesn't just go to one passage. I'm going to write about this, and I want you to go look at this Old Testament passage, because I'm going to take some things from that Old Testament passage and teach you something. No, what John does is, I want to say something here, or this is what I saw, and I'm going to relate what I saw. And he winds up drawing the information from 4 or 5 passages. And you're just supposed to know how to parse all that out. He combines things. He amalgamates things. This is why, again, it's messy. It's not just a clean citation of one thing. He puts them all in a blender, and that's what you get. And that's what he's doing here. So, when we do all this talk about Sinai and God's appearance there, doesn't mean we're not talking about Ezekiel 1, Isaiah 6. We're talking about all of it. Okay? If you look at the creatures that surround the throne in Revelation 4, 6 to 8, on the surface, they're the cherubim from Ezekiel 1. But the fact that their wings are numbered at 6 is a detail not found in Ezekiel 1. There, the cherubim have 4 wings. The 6 count comes from Isaiah 6. And the seraphim. So again, we have this blending of sources. John is combining the descriptions. There's also an interesting modification. It's a combination, but I'm going to use the word modification because of the way John puts the two together. In Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 10, the cherubim are not said to have eyes or be full of eyes. The eyes and the things full of eyes are the wheels. The wheels have the eyes. The wheels are full of eyes, not the cherubim. And Ezekiel 10:12, actually, I'm just a sidebar here, is not inconsistent with that. It just depends how that verse is translated in English versions, so I'm not going to rabbit trail on that. But in Revelation 4, the term is living creatures. Okay, he doesn't actually call them cherubim. I mean, John could have done that. But it's interesting, he calls them living creatures. He doesn't call them cherubim or seraphim, and it's the living creatures who are full of eyes. And the point is not that they have eyes, but that they are filled with eyes. They are full of eyes. So why does John blend these things and then sort of mix the data points from those things in the way he describes the throne scene in Revelation 4 and 5? I think what he's doing here is actually conceptually consistent with Ezekiel 1. This is where you don't really so much see this in Isaiah 6. But, Isaiah 6 has some elements. Again, God does have throne guardians. They're just described differently because we have an Egyptian context there. But let's just track on Ezekiel 1 because that's where the eyes imagery comes from. So I think for sure, John has something to communicate here in the context of Revelation 4 and 5, in the context of an apocalypse, that God's enemies are going to get judged. The nations are going to get judged. All the wicked are going to get judged. God is sovereign. That is a conceptual point that is conveyed in Ezekiel 1 using astrological or astronomical imagery from Babylonian religion. Okay, those of you who have followed my content for a while, I have a blog post on this, on my website about how we have things in Ezekiel 1 that very clearly point to the Babylonian zodiac and astral imagery that are used to make a very specific point about who controls time and history. It is not Marduk of Babylon. It is the God of Israel. And even though in Ezekiel 1, the Jews are sitting there, they're captives, they're in a foreign land. They've been thrown out because of their apostasy. God, their God, is the one still on the throne. That's the whole point of Ezekiel 1, and it's communicated through this astral imagery. I'm going to try to summarize it here. John it wants to communicate the same thing. All hell is going to break loose on earth. It's going to be terrible. The righteous will suffer. Yes, there will be a remnant. Remember, what the flood was like. God did save a remnant. He promised he would not annihilate everyone. There will always be a remnant. And even if the righteous die, they will be resurrected and be with the Lord at the end. We find that out at the end of the book of Revelation when all this comes full circle. So he's reminding them of that, but he's also reminding them of what the teaching point of Ezekiel 1 is. The God of Israel is the one in control of the cycles of time and history. Nobody else is. So here in Revelation 4 and 5, the context is a divine council meeting. The council meets to begin unleashing God's judgment on the earth, and the wicked will be punished, the righteous will be vindicated, martyrs will be avenged, supernatural powers will be destroyed, the nations will ultimately be healed, but in the course of doing all that, it's going to be really bad. And finally, Eden will return to earth. It is the day of the Lord time. And just as Ezekiel's imagery conveys cosmic sovereignty, so does John's. That's the conceptual overlap. John is consistent here. He's just throwing lots of things into the blender. I think for new listeners, I probably ought to rabbit trail a little bit as to explain why I take this tack that I do on Ezekiel 1. And so I'm just gonna quote from some stuff I've been working on in terms of writing. This book that I've been working on for years, and maybe I'll never have an end. The book is about the use of and abuse of astronomy and sacred calendar in end times thinking. And here's what I write about Ezekiel 1 and Revelation 4. So I have a little section on this. It is well known that Ezekiel's vision included wheels within wheels, whose rims were tall and awesome and full of eyes. That's Ezekiel 1:17 through 18. Again, that's important about the rims, the observation with the rims. That the eyes, again, are within the heavenly throne creatures in Revelation 4 is interesting. It's important. And of course, the eyes on the rims that are full of eyes in Ezekiel 1, what are these things? What are these things? So just to draw a little bit more, from this thing I've been writing, working on, I write this. Old Testament scholar Daniel Block notes that the word translated eyes, okay, the word for eyes is ayin, in Ezekiel 1:17 and 18, had been used earlier for sparkle or gleam in the same chapter of Ezekiel 1:4 and Ezekiel 1:16. So the same word is used for eyes and for sparkling and gleaming. And this may point the way to its interpretation here. Sparkling and gleaming are, of course, familiar descriptions for what? Stars. Throughout ancient literature, by the way. Block elsewhere makes the important observation that the four faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision correspond to the four signs for the cardinal direction points. Okay? We could get into a little footnote here where, what about the difference between the four faces between Ezekiel 1 and 10? And again, Block has a nice explanation for that. Basically, it depends on which way the things are oriented. And I'm not going to rabbit trail there, but the two visions are actually consistent here. There's not a contradiction. So we have here Block, making the point that, hey, if you look at the faces of the cherubim in Ezekiel's vision, lo and behold, they correspond to the four cardinal points of the zodiac in Babylon. They just do. These compass points, these cardinal points, in turn, had correspondence, again, to what the Babylonians were thinking, what they thought, in what they were trying to communicate by having a zodiac. Now, just to go a little bit more, these points are noteworthy. They were not overlooked by the Apostle John in the New Testament. The heavenly throne scene in Revelation 4 and 5 borrows this terminology and other elements in Ezekiel 1. We've seen a bunch of those today. He borrows them to describe heavenly creatures this time, full of eyes in front and behind. Revelation 4:6. And here I quote another scholar, Pilch, in a Revelation commentary. As Pilch notes, this is one of the ways that the ancients describe stars, and specifically constellations. Animals, creatures, full of eyes. And again, the terminology for eyes also being used for gleaming and sparkling in the same chapter of Ezekiel 1. You say, well, in Ezekiel 1, they're in the rims. Right. Rims are what? Things that go in circles. Wheels go in circles, and the zodiac goes in a circle. Okay? The ancients called stars eyes and thought them to be living entities. Constellated stars made full of eyes were perceived as animate beings like persons or animals. Since Ezekiel uses all 4 constellations moving at once, his vantage point was high above the entire cosmos. Ezekiel is describing the heavenly throne chariot of Yahweh. This is a stock description of God's throne chariot. The divine throne in biblical days was just what Ezekiel described, supported by, cherubim, these winged, creatures. It had wheels. I mean, all the elements are there. And you could go out on the web and find my blog post on this. You'd probably find a few, pictures as well. Again, this is just the way you describe the throne of a king or the throne of a deity. This is the throne in Ezekiel 1 of Yahweh. The Hebrew term often translated chariot is Merkabah. The plural is Merkavot. And you'll find it in Joel 2:5, Zechariah 6:1, for example. Like typical ancient throne chariots known from scripture and other art, Yahweh's Merkabah is surrounded and supported by cherubim. Since Yahweh's Merkabah is in the heavens, those cherubim are quite naturally part of the visual sky. Consequently, Ezekiel's comments about the stars being in both the wheels and, again, factoring in the cherubim images, it's consistent. It's consistent. He is seeing the constellations move through the heavens in their regular cyclic path, which forms a wheel. Wheels are circular. The wheels within wheels is a way of symbolically describing the stars, constellations in their courses. Stars and constellations do what? They mark time. The messaging of Ezekiel 1 has a very specific aim. Ezekiel's vision proclaims to the captives from Judah exiled in Babylon that the heavenly king who controls the cycles of time and history is not Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon at the time, but Yahweh of Israel. That John uses the cherubim imagery and describes living creatures filled with eyes is significant. In his context, not of the eyes of Ezekiel earlier, it seems pretty clear he's describing constellations in heaven, or the heavens, which of course is where God lives and is enthroned. The messaging would be the same. God is in control of time and history. He and his council are about to make that quite clear as they render judgment throughout the rest of the book of Revelation. So this is why John does what he does. He's trying to communicate the same message. God is on the throne, and it's going to be the Lamb, okay? The Lamb's going to be part of this. We have the risen Christ described as the Ancient of Days, who in Daniel 7 is on the throne. I mean, all of these things just sort of converge and merge together. Voice like a trumpet, the fire, the jewels, the white clothes. I mean, all of this stuff is drawn from divine council imagery. It's drawn from the place where God lives. It's drawn from the throne of God, which is in the heavens. And up, if we look at the heavens, we see creatures that move in circles, cycles of time. Who's in control of time and history? Well, this is part of the illustration, the complex, the understanding of the throne of God. God, and who sits on thrones but kings, okay? So who is the king of time and the passage of time and history? And who how does history, play out? It play out with nations, geopolitical entities, and people. Okay, who is in control of all that? God, Christ, the Lamb, the Son of Man. I mean, the Ancient of Days. The answer is yes, okay? This is why John is doing what he's doing. He's trying to communicate the same theological messaging. Now you ask logically, well, what's up with the 24 elders? What's up with the 24 elders? And that, at least, is a good place to stop, for this episode. We're going to have a part 3 necessary for time. But the 24 elders are part of this. And the question is how? How do we, sort of what interpretive trajectory might we follow here? There's going to be several possibilities here. Is this another astral image? Does the number 24 have some astral significance? That's one question. Or is the number related to the tribes of Israel and the apostles, 12 and 12? It would seem the latter, but the apostles aren't dead and glorified yet, at least, at the very least, John is still alive, even with a late date for Revelation. If this is written in the earlier date, you're probably going to get more apostles alive. So, why do we see them in, does that get in the way of seeing them as the second 12 unit, up here at the throne? Does that bother that idea, that approach? Does seeing 24 as including glorified apostles, some of whom aren't dead yet, is that awkward? Maybe it seems a little bit awkward. Does it matter? Does the number 24 have some other meaning that would align with the more general cloud of witnesses? Human believers as part of the council idea. Talked about that in the book of Hebrews. Again, we'll go through the options next time. That's what we're going to do in part 3, and hopefully in part 3, we'll do that and then loop some of the stuff that might be new as we go into and through chapter 5. Again, just try to get through Revelation 4 and 5, but there's just a lot of stuff here. It's cluttered. It's dense. Again, this is what John does. So we're in another one of these passages where he's just letting it fly, and you're supposed to know where the pieces come and what he's doing when he puts them together.
Well, Mike, we any Neanderthals in Revelation 4 today?
No.
This is the last part of chapter 4.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the Bible?
No, I looked, but I couldn't find any.
Yeah.
Unsuccessful there.
That's unfortunate. It doesn't have Texas in there? It doesn't have Texas in the Bible? Really? Because there's lots of Texans think that Texas is in the Bible.
Well,
I made that
you're
up,
going to have to correct them. Tell them the book of Revelation is all about America, not just Texas. How's that?
Okay. Well, us Texans only think about Texas, not really the Union. So,
right.
We're a little
just like a lot of people conflate Israel and America. You guys conflate America and Texas, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying Texas is the new Israel. Is that what I'm saying?
Filled with Neanderthals, boy. Yeah, I'll look for this. I'll look for this on an Ancient Aliens episode to come. Yeah, we'll probably get that. Giorgio, if you're listening, there you go. You can thank me later. Maybe I get a royalty for that.
I'm waiting for another show to quote our show or do something like that. That'd be, wouldn't that be fun if we popped up on The Simpsons or, something random? That'd be awesome. Be part of pop culture.
So you think of the fun side. I think of, it sort of makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But
yeah, no, I get
what people might do.
Yeah, lots of people are like, this is a Bible show. Y'all don't need to talk about sports and aliens and stuff. It's like,
well, see, now we're including Neanderthals, so we're widening the berth here.
Yeah, but we're going to get some blowback. I'm going to get some emails chewing me out for having too much fun on the Bible show.
All right. All right. Well, we don't want you to have any more fun, so let's just start into Revelation 4.
Sounds good.
All right. Yeah, this is part 3. As it worked out, this is just the way things fell. I didn't want to loop chapter 5 in here, so we're going to do a discrete episode on chapter 5 to wrap up these two that are, this divine council throne room scene. We're going to spend today really just covering a couple of verses that deal with one item, and that is the 24 elders. So I'm going to just read where they show up in chapter 4. I mean, they're going to pop up in chapter 5 too, but by then we'll already have covered it. So Revelation 4:4 says, around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. Then if you skip ahead a little bit, you hit verses 9 and 10, first part of verse 10, which read, and whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who is seated on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. So the question is kind of obvious here. Who or what are the 24 elders? And there are two possible trajectories in the Old Testament for the language here, the elder language, though not really the number, at least in terms of being explicit. So I'm going to quote here, just to sort of summarize the two trajectories, or at least, get us into this part. I'm going to quote On's commentary again, in Revelation 1 through 5, his first of 3 volumes in the Word Biblical Commentary series. He says, there are two Old Testament passages in which a group of elders is depicted as present before Yahweh. Number one, Isaiah 24:23, which describes an eschatological event. And then he quotes it. For the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders he will manifest his glory. And secondly, Exodus 24:9 and 10. That's the narrative of the 70 elders who accompanied Moses up to Mount Sinai, where they had a vision of God. And On says the author may have derived his conception of 24 elders surrounding the heavenly throne of God from these two passages, or may at least be alluding to them. And that's the end of his quote. Now, again, those are the two sort of directions you could go. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but if you've read Unseen Realm, you know that I take Isaiah 24:23 as describing celestial elders, supernatural beings, divine council, not humans. And of course, Exodus 24, you do have humans. We have Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Abihu and the 70 elders. They go up Mount Sinai and they see the God of Israel and have a feast, have a meal. So we have sort of a celestial, divine, and a human trajectory, one of each. And these are the two paths you could go. Now, just a heads up, I'm going to suggest at one point here, when we go through the material, that you don't really need the dichotomy. The dichotomy is a bit of a false dichotomy, but for the sake of starting off, there you go. Now, the identity of the elders, Beale writes, this is not Beale, this is Baumgarten. I brought in an article, Joseph Baumgarten, who wrote an article called The Duodecimal Courts. Duodecimal is a term that refers to 12 themes. The duodecimal courts of Qumran, Revelation, and the Sanhedrin. It's from the Journal of Biblical Literature. That's a 1976 article. So he makes the comment that the identity of the elders, quote, has been one of the long-standing and still unresolved problems in the interpretation of Revelation, unquote. So Beale, sort of building off that, summarizes the interpretive options adduced by scholars. Now, again, you have these two trajectories, but the two trajectories have produced a number of interpretive, approaches to this. So Beale writes, now a heavenly entourage around the throne is pictured in Revelation 4. The elders have been variously identified as 1, stars from an astrological background, 2, angels, 3, Old Testament saints, that would be people, the righteous, 4, angelic heavenly representatives of all saints, both Old and New Testament. 5, patriarchs and apostles representing the Old Testament and New Testament saints, again, the righteous together. And 6, representatives of the prophetic revelation of the 24 books of the Old Testament. Of course, that would be according to the Hebrew arrangement and canon and all that. Now, nobody really spends much attention on that last one, and I'm not going to either, because the other ones are so much better options. Baumgarten observes that the church fathers and ancient commentators generally took the 24 elders to be glorified saints, again, glorified righteous people. Some modern exegetes have tried to advance the view that they were angels. Recently, there has been a return to the former option, again, the glorified righteous saints, but no adequate rationale for the number 24 has been offered. So, unquote. Again, Baumgarten basically saying we got problems here. Now, consequently, most of the discussion about the 24 elders has been oriented to really the second through the fifth options. Angels, Old Testament saints, angelic representatives of all the saints in both testaments, or patriarchs and apostles, again, also representing Old and New Testament saints. So those options 2 through 5, so 4 options there. And that's really where the discussion lives. And at times, the distinctions between them are pretty blurred. Now, each of those options has some connection to the Old Testament. After all, this series is the book of Revelation's use of the Old Testament. All of these have some connection to the Old Testament. And Beale sort of is illustrative where he kind of lands. You're going to see that the lines are blurred in the list that he himself gave. He writes, the elders certainly include reference to Old Testament and New Testament saints, So he's going that way. They are either angels representing all saints or the heads of the 12 tribes together with the 12 apostles, representing thus all the people of God. So he kind of merges two or three of these options. Beale, supports his reasoning in this regard by noting that earlier in the book, a close relationship between angels and the people of God is suggested via the lampstand imagery, which applies to the churches and in its Old Testament source, Zechariah 4, divine beings in the presence of God. He also notes, again, Beale also notes the white garments and crowns worn by the elders. Okay, that's what they're wearing. These are items associated with human believers who keep their faith until the end. And again, this is well-traveled turf in the last few episodes, but the allusion here specifically is to Revelation 2:10, Revelation 3:4, and 3:11. And then, again, to follow that, he writes this. Beale says, the readers are given a look into heaven to see that the saints of old, together with the deceased Christians who have persevered, again, think of the white robes and crowns here. That's how he's tying in the martyrs here. The readers are given a look into heaven to see that the saints of old, together with deceased Christians who have persevered, have received the heavenly reward of crowns, white clothing, and kingship. The readers can be assured that they too will receive a like reward if they are faithful to the end. In Revelation, angels never wear crowns or white clothing or sit on thrones. That one's debatable because, again, if that's where you fall with the 24 elders, that he would not be correct there. But what he's saying is that you'll never see the word angel, sitting on a throne. Okay, that much is fair, but it's a bit of a misdirection. So back up here. In Revelation, he says, angels never wear crowns or white clothing or sit on thrones. But such descriptions are predicated only of saints, again, the righteous, who are in heaven. He cites Revelation 7:13 through 15, 19:7 through 8, and 19:14. So they're predicated only of saints who are in heaven or of the saints' reward after death as a result of their perseverance. And here he cites Revelation 2:10, Revelation 3:4 and 5, 3:21, and chapter 20, verse 4. So that's where Beale lands. A little bit of a blurring of distinction, but he's definitely, I'd say it's fair to say, the majority of his thinking is sort of on the human trajectory, or at least the glorified human trajectory. Now, other scholars have opted for 12 representatives of Israel's original tribes and the 12 apostles by analogy to the two 12s of Revelation 21. So let's not forget about this 12 and 12 thing in Beale's list. And, so some say, well, hey, look at Revelation 21, where the gates of the New Jerusalem correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel, but the foundations correspond to the apostles. So you got 12 and 12, obviously equaling 24. So the reasoning is that the New Jerusalem symbolizes the new Israel, comprised of the first people of God, Old Testament Israel, and the new Israel, the church. Okay, so this is, again, another notion that is sort of, is on the human trajectory, but it's more symbolic, the 12 and 12, the tribes and the apostles. Now, what Beale says and what these other scholars would say, again, the predominantly human trajectory, all that is true, but there are outliers in the data. For example, members of God's council may lack crowns, but they do sit on thrones. That's Daniel 7, 9 through 10. And if we've learned anything about Revelation 4 up to this point, it tracks Daniel 7 like 14 points in the same order. And the celestial heavenly host in Daniel 7 is meeting. It's a divine council meeting. It's a divine courtroom. And they have some participatory role in God making a decision here. They open the books, all of these motifs that we've talked about before. So, yeah, okay, they don't have crowns, but they do have some authority here. They do have a participatory role. They participate in his governance, in God's governance. Further, Isaiah 24:23, make sure I get that number right. Isaiah 24:23, references Yahweh's elders. Again, this is a passage I talk about in Unseen Realm. And I suggested there, and will continue to suggest, that the most plausible interpretation of that passage is Yahweh's celestial supernatural council, not human beings. Okay? Now, I reference an article in Unseen Realm by Timothy Willis in this regard. The title of it is Yahweh's Elders, Isaiah 24:23. Subtitle, Senior Officials of the Divine Court. Okay, that's a 1991 article. So I'm going to drift back into that just a little bit here. While there are Old Testament passages that suggest the eventuality of believers being glorified as members of the heavenly family council, okay, while that idea is foreshadowed, that in the end, believers will, just to quote Genesis 15, and this will take your minds back, if you're a longtime podcast listener, to our conversations with David Burnett about the star seed in Genesis 15:6. When God takes Abraham out, shows him the stars of the sky, and it says, your descendants, your offspring, are going to be like the stars of heaven. And how that's not only a quantitative statement, but in Second Temple Judaism, and of course also suggested in the New Testament, it's also a qualitative statement. That eventually your seed, those who are the seed of Abraham, i.e. believers, are going to be like the stars of heaven, which were considered, again, the sons of God, angels, okay, if you want to use that term. So, that's true. There's this foreshadowing, but despite that, there's no explicit Old Testament reference to the idea sort of being current, like happening now, or in the past, or something that's already going on, like you get in the New Testament. You get this language in Revelation, 4 and 5, with the martyrs. You get it in Hebrews 12, the cloud of witnesses. They're enrolled in the, among the celestial group in heaven there. Let me just quote Hebrews 12 here. We recently did an episode on this, but just to capture the wording again, the whole cloud of witnesses episode. But I think what's really important in that passage are verses 22 through 23. So verse 1, everybody knows, therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, blah, 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 blah. And we talked in that episode about what the cloud of witnesses means. And I think key to understanding it are verses 22 and 23 in the same chapter. But you, again, he's talking to believers, have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Of course, this is the same book, Hebrews, back in Hebrews 2, where believers are introduced to God and God to believers in the midst of the congregation, the midst of the council. So we get the book of Hebrews, and we get other New Testament books that sort of have this already but not quite yet feel to it. But that goes beyond the Old Testament. Now, why am I belaboring this point? Because if the concept goes beyond the Old Testament, if all the Old Testament really offers here is a foreshadowing that's going to be associated in the future with the Messiah, with the kingdom, the new Jerusalem, let's even throw a new covenant in there. Okay, that's what Daniel 12 would be talking about, the end of days. Okay, all the Old Testament can do is foreshadow this. Then, by definition, Yahweh's elders in Isaiah 24:23 are not humans. That's the divine council, made up of celestial beings only. That's the point. That's why I'm belaboring it. Isaiah 24:23 is prior to these New Testament passages and prior to Second Temple material, which makes it all the more likely a reference to the heavenly host council. Now, I might as well just quote, I think I have a little bit here from Willis. Make sure. Now, this is what I said about Willis in Unseen Realm. So let me throw this out here. I wrote in Unseen Realm, the inclusion of martyrs in the scene in Revelation 6:9 through 11, a little bit later, seems to require that the elders are also distinct from glorified believers. Okay, if you actually go and look at Revelation 6:9 through 11, let's take a peek there. Revelation 6:9. We're talking about outliers to Beale's. These are glorified righteous. Okay. Again, okay, what he said, how he defends that is okay, but again, he doesn't address the outliers. So in Revelation 6:9, we read, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. Okay, there's the martyred righteous. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of the fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, and who were to be killed as they themselves had been. Now, these souls of those under the altar, this shows up in the Revelation 4 and 5 scene, and they have to be distinct from the elders is the point. So that mars the neatness of what Beale is arguing for in terms of the human trajectory. I'll say one more thing before moving on. The whole notion about the Old Testament foreshadowing the glorification of human beings, again, this qualitative concept that believers will be made like the stars and so on and so forth. This is actually really important because in Second Temple Jewish literature, this is a significant theme. Burnett, again, Dave Burnett, when we had him on, we talked about a little bit about this, but if you really want the detail, you should go to my website, drmsh.com, and there's actually a blog series written by David Burnett on Paul's use of Genesis 15:5. 15:5. I think he's pretty restricted to 15:5, not 6. But Paul's use of Genesis 15:5 in Romans 4:18, in light of early Jewish deification traditions. So if you want, the detail to this, how the promise given to Abraham is not just quantitative but qualitative. It speaks of believers being glorified and being, numbered among the stars of the divine council. But anyway, this is important. It's an important idea because what it does is it blurs both of those Old Testament trajectories. So where I'm going to wind up here is that there's no reason to pick. That we have to pick. Oh, is it the glorified righteous, or is it the divine council members? And the answer is yeah. Yeah, because we are going to be members of the council, and the cloud of witnesses suggests that that's an already reality, but not yet. I mean, we're not at the end of days. We're not at ultimate glorification. Again, but these two things merge, and they get merged before the New Testament. The New Testament has this talk, partakers of the divine nature. You're already partakers of the divine nature. That's a passage in Peter. But yet we're not yet glorified. 1 John talks about our glorification. We have this already aspect and the not yet. And it's associated with, again, being members in God's heavenly family council. We are children and partners. Okay, this is what God wanted from the very beginning. So in Second Temple literature, this idea, because people are looking back at Genesis 15:5, people are looking at other passages, and they come up with the development of this concept. Now, On points out that Second Temple Jewish literature, again, has a lot of precedent for this, has precedent for seeing the elders that occupy thrones around God himself as being members of the heavenly host. And again, that's going to turn into, again, this sort of merging or including glorified human believers in it. So, but let's just start with, again, picking up on my slant here, because I think Isaiah 24:23 does speak of non-human, celestial divine council members. And so somebody like On would say, yeah, there's good evidence for that too in Second Temple literature. It's not just, the human trajectory, although, again, we're going to loop that in. But On writes, a more conventional conception of the arrangement of heavenly beings who surround God on his heavenly throne is for them to flank the throne on the right and the left, as in 1 Kings 22. And very familiar divine council passage. There can be no doubt, however, that the author understands the 24 elders as encircling the throne, so he's just commenting on the posture here and the arrangement. For the location of many thrones near the throne of God, see Daniel 7:9. Again, we already cited that. And for the conception of one or more thrones in each of a series of heavens, apparently occupied by an angelic leader, see, and then he lists some passages. Most of them are from the Ascension of Isaiah. 7:14, 7:19, 7:24, 7:20. I mean, basically read Isaiah, Ascension of Isaiah 7 and 8. A little bit in chapter 9, a little bit in chapter 24, or chapter 11, excuse me. So it's there. Now, where you get more of it, again, is when the human sort of, the idea that human righteous are part of an angelic priesthood. That's at Qumran. We'll get to that in a moment. But that's where humans are looped into this. But the point here is that there are good reasons to take Isaiah 24:23 as not including humans. And if that's the case, then why can't that idea be what John is thinking of in Revelation 4 and 5? He's thinking of, again, the celestial heavenly host in Isaiah 24, and he calls them elders. We've got Daniel 7, where God meets with his celestial council, and that is the model, that is the, that's the well from which Revelation 4 comes. So why do we have to go all of a sudden and say, well, these must be people, glorified people? Why can't they be just divine council members? So that's the other side of this. So Beale leans toward the human, and lots of people do. There's this other argument for the divine, the celestial divine council. But again, as I've already hinted, these two things are, maybe they're just not a necessary choice. Again, we don't have to really opt for one or the other. Again, does it really matter? I mean, because you're going to have plenty of data for both. Are the 24 elders of Yahweh's council human believers in heaven or celestial members of the heavenly host? In biblical thought, the question really seems like a moot one, because human believers are destined to be glorified and joined to the divine council. Now, this is a familiar idea to those of you who are familiar with my content, Unseen Realm, have listened to the podcast before. But I want to track through some of what I wrote and then go into the Qumran material just to show you how these things get merged or can be merged, or at least in the Second Temple period on in toward the first century that this is happening. So in the book of Revelation, let's just start there. Jesus is not only referred to as the morning star, but he grants the morning star to believers. This is one thread. The implications are noteworthy. I wrote in Unseen Realm that the morning star phrase takes us back once more to the Old Testament, which at times uses astral terminology to describe divine beings. Job 38 is the best example. The morning stars were singing together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Stars were bright and, in the worldview of the ancients, living divine beings, since they moved in the sky and were beyond the human realm. The morning star language in Revelation 2:28 is messianic. It refers to a divine being who would come from Judah. We know this by considering two other passages in tandem. In Numbers 24:17, we read the prophecy that, quote, a star will go out from Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel. Okay, that is not a reference to the birth star, okay, because the star goes out from Jacob. Okay, the birth star didn't. It's not a reference to the thing in the sky, because Jacob, the tribe of Jacob, isn't in the sky. Okay, this is tribal talk. The word star is used to say essentially that a divine being, specifically a divine king, because it's from Judah, okay, will arise. A scepter will rise from Israel. Numbers 24:17, back to the quote, was considered messianic in Judaism, completely apart from the New Testament writers. In other words, literate readers of John's writing would have known the morning star reference was not about literal brightness. It was about the dawning of the returned kingdom of God under its Messiah. Later in the book of Revelation, Jesus himself refers to his messianic standing with the morning star language. Revelation 22:16, I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. Later I wrote, as Daniel says, the righteous, here's where we get the righteous looped in again, the righteous will shine like the brightness of the sky above, like the stars forever and ever. Daniel 12:2 and 3. Our inheritance of the nations with Jesus at the end of days, Revelation 3:21, is in a glorified, resurrected, i.e. divine state. The star language of Genesis 15 again, has this eschatological connotation. Now that thinking in Revelation, where you have celestial being and glorified human being spoken of in the same way, in this case, authority in the kingdom. Think of the council. Think councils have authority, all right? Where you blur, or at least merge is the better word, the deity divine, okay, Jesus with human, glorified believers. They're members of the same body. Jesus, says that he'll grant to the one that overcomes to sit on his throne with him in Revelation 3. And he will share with them the morning star, Revelation 2. Again, this is inclusion in the council and its inclusion and authority. Both sides, start to, again, be blended here. This line of thinking is consistent with wider Second Temple Jewish thought that human believers, when glorified, will become members of God's heavenly entourage. This point of theology is well known from Second Temple Jewish sources and the literature of Qumran, especially, whose occupants saw themselves as an angelic priesthood. This belief in a presumed symbiosis between the earthly and heavenly priesthood servants of God may provide a point of connection to the number of the elders as well, which some suggest derives from the 24 priestly courses described in 1 Chronicles 23 and 24. Maybe that's where we get the 24. Maybe it's about a heavenly priesthood that is both divine, but also earthly. Okay, we've got, again, this merging going on. Consider the elements. Just think about the elements of the scene. Revelation 4 and 5 is based on Daniel 7. A council scene in which all authority is given to the Son of Man. Remember how Daniel 7 ends? All the authority is given to the Son of Man. The Son of Man, Jesus, is the morning star who shares his authority with human believers, specifically sharing his throne in Revelation 3:21. And he sets believers over the nations being judged in Revelation 2:26. To this we could add the description in the book of Hebrews, again, where believers are part of a great cloud of witnesses, which is language drawn from celestial court imagery in ancient covenants. These believers have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God. Oh, isn't that what's described in the book of Revelation? The New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. Hebrews 12 has believers coming to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled. They are enrolled in heaven. And those believers will, as Paul says, judge angels. 1 Corinthians 6:3. And the point here is that a choice between glorified humans and celestial agents of the heavenly divine council isn't really necessary. The categories overlap. That's the point. So this is where, at this point, in the episode, this is where I'd say, this I think is a really good way to look at it. At the 24 elders, okay, you got 12 and 12, 24. I'm not bothered by the whole symbolic attempt here, but I think wherever you land on how you talk about the 24 elders, you need to affirm that the divine council, in terms of the supernatural character of it, is not denied. In other words, the humans don't squeeze out the divine elements here of the council. Rather, humans are included in the council. So however you want to talk about that, and again, you go back to Beale's 5 or 6 options, all the elements are there, both the celestial, again, if you want to use the word angelic element to the council, along with glorified humans. Yeah, they're all that stuff is there. So we need to find a way to talk about the 24 elders that includes both sides of the coin without squeezing one out of the other. Now here's the wild card. What about the astral interpretation of the 24 elders? That was the first thing Beale listed. And I've mentioned this before. Now I'm gonna again more or less just tell you where I'm going with this. The divine council in the Old Testament is described in very explicit astral language, and believers, glorified believers who will join the council, are described in very explicit astral language. Daniel 12 will shine as the stars. Genesis 15. You'll be as the stars of the sky. Again, just go back and read through the Burnett series, and you get all the primary source data from the Second Temple period about this. In other words, Mike isn't making it up, and neither is Dave Burnett. This is how they were thinking about this kind of stuff, this star language associated with the divine council. So would it really be inconsistent if we also looked at the 24 elders astrally, as astral talk? The short answer is no, it wouldn't. In fact, that would sort of lend another perspective to the same things we're talking about. Divine council, in this case, made up of supernatural beings and glorified humans. And the way we telegraph this idea is the astral talk from the Old Testament. Okay? Now, obviously we're not going to take time on this episode to go through all the astral talk of the Old Testament. I've just given you a few, passages, to think about. There are, of course, more. We've hit Daniel 12 here. We've hit Genesis 15:5. We've hit, what was Job 38, the stars, Isaiah 14 you could throw in there. I mean, there's plenty of this astral talk, in the Old Testament. So let's just go down that trajectory a little bit and talk about, what about the astral approach? Now, On and Beale are skeptical of the approach generally. They don't really seem to connect the dots here between glorified humans and the celestial star language stuff. I don't know why, because it's not hard to see. Maybe it's just they're not used to looking at things that way. But again, it's not hard to see. And if you want the primary source data, go to the blog series by Burnett. And you'll get references there too in bibliography. So On and Beale, a little skeptical of the approach. They presume, maybe this is why, they presume the imagery must come from the Babylonian zodiac and that Old Testament correlations are more likely. Now, wait a minute. Are you suggesting then, professors, that astral imagery in the Old Testament doesn't have a connection to Babylonian stuff? If you're suggesting that, you would be incorrect. Ezekiel 1. Okay, we'll get there in a moment. Now, it is true that the zodiacal system would have its point of origin in Mesopotamia. Okay, everybody sort of knows that. But all cultures of the Mediterranean region, including that of ancient Israel, the Second Temple Jews, they all utilize the zodiac for observing the celestial sky. So big deal if it comes from Babylon. Everybody used it. It's kind of like a meaningless objection. Plus, if you throw Ezekiel 1 in there, it's kind of a misguided objection. Now, there's a good deal of evidence for Jewish astrological beliefs in Second Temple Jewish texts. And this evidence should not, let me emphasize this evidence should not be interpreted as a concession to heterodox pagan religion. Rather, Judaism held to its theological orthodoxy, parsing astronomical phenomena and astrological concepts through a belief in Yahweh as the ruler of the cosmos. And this blend actually gets visible representation by zodiac mosaics in ancient synagogues. Yes, there are zodiac mosaics in ancient synagogues. Now, if you want, again, some sources here, just generally something that's accessible online, I would say probably the best thing to look up on using Google is author's name is Lester Ness, LesterNess, Lester Ness, and you'll find his book Written in the Stars, Ancient Zodiac Mosaics. It's his dissertation. He did his dissertation at the Miami University of Ohio under Edwin Yamauchi, who is an evangelical, and so is Lester Ness. But it's a really good dissertation. I think he teaches, I don't know if he still teaches, but he taught for many years in China. Lester Ness did, but he put his dissertation online. So there you go. You can have it. It's also been published in hard copy form too. I mean, there are other sources that you can just use Google Scholar for this sort of thing. Zodiac mosaics, Judaism. You're going to find lots of stuff. But anyway, that one's free and accessible. So back to the point here, the fact that you could have zodiac imagery. Who cares if it comes from Babylon? That's where astronomy stuff came from, and everybody's using it. Number two, well, so does Ezekiel 1. We don't look at Ezekiel 1 askance, for that. And third, we have primary source data, let's put it that way, that Jews did have zodiacal thinking as in their theology, that it didn't steer them away from Orthodox Yahwism, because Yahweh was the one who created these objects, wasn't he? And he is their master. What Jews and later Christians rejected in terms of astrology stuff is the idea that the objects in the sky could dictate and control individual fate. That was theologically anathema, because only God is sovereign. Period. Okay? These things do not decree individual fate. They serve God. They serve their creator. Anyway, let's go back to the whole approach. Scholars who have championed the astral zodiac approach are few. There aren't many of these. The most notable contemporary scholar is the late Bruce Malina. Dr. Malin passed away a few years ago. He was a New Testament scholar specializing in applying the social sciences to New Testament culture and interpretation. And Malina argued for the astral view based on several textual considerations that were then parsed according to ancient astronomical or astrological thought. If you want to get sort of his whole commentary on Revelation, it's published in a book. It's still, available on Amazon. It's called The Genre and Message of the Book of Revelation. And the subtitle is something about star journeys and visions or whatever. Okay. Now, I've said before on the podcast that the book has, I think, rightly been reviewed negatively in that Malina neglects to connect this stuff to Old Testament material. I think that's a legitimate criticism. In other words, he sees the astral road and gets on it and never departs, and never bothers to sort of try to marry it to Old Testament material. That's a legitimate criticism. However, he has a lot of data. That really makes sense. So the last sentence a few seconds ago, I said something like, what Malin is arguing for is he's looking at the text. There are certain features of the Revelation 4 and 5 vision that John has. And he pulls those out, he observes those things, and then he interprets them according to ancient astronomical, astrological thought. Here, let me give you some examples of how this approach would sort of work. First, the throne of Revelation 4 and 5 is, drum roll please, heavenly. In other words, it's said to be in the heavens. Revelation 4, 1 and 2, it just says that point blank. So Malin is like, well, why don't we consider the heavens then? If that's where the vision, is sort of situated. Number 2, God's throne is situated above the firmament. We know this from the Old Testament. And the firmament was conceived as this solid dome over the earth in ancient cosmology. We're talking about the firmament created in Genesis 1:6 that separated the waters below it from the waters above it. And Genesis 1:6 is your verse. You could compare that to Proverbs 8:27 and 28, Job 37:18, which has the firmament being solid and hard as brass, and this kind of language, okay? God, in the Old Testament, quote, walks upon the vault in this firmament, the vault of heaven. He walks on it, Job 22:14. Psalm 29:10 says the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. In other words, over these waters up there above the firmament. God builds, quote, he builds his upper chambers in the heavens and founds his vault upon the earth. Amos 9:6. The dome rests upon the earth and God lives above it. In Revelation 4:5, meteorological phenomena emanate from the throne. Malin says, hey, have you read verse 5 in Revelation 4? You get flashes of lightning, peals of thunder. That's like sky stuff, okay? Up there. So consequently, Malin says the sea of glass before the throne, and really under the throne, is likely to be understood as the firmament. Malin would say, well, let's try that out. Let's just put that one away and consider it. Third, given that the cherubim imagery of Ezekiel 1 repurposed in Revelation 4 corresponds to the 4 points of the Babylonian zodiac, an astral significance to John's throne description and 24 elders seems to make sense. Now, we talked about this before as far as the Ezekiel 1 imagery. We've spent some time before on the podcast in that material. And if you remember, I cited Dan Block, his commentary on Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 1, he makes this point. The 4 faces of the cherubim are the 4 cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. And the theology is significant. You have the eyes and the wheels, okay? The wheel is a circuit. It goes around, okay? And you've got eyes in the wheels, and depending on how you take chapter 10, verse 12, you could have the eyes in, the creatures. You certainly have the eyes in the creatures in Revelation. And eyes in the creatures and the wheels, and they all have eyes. This is constellations, and constellations go around. They have cycles. Again, this is astronomical/astrological imagery that Ezekiel is using in chapter 1 of his vision. This is what he sees. And what does it communicate? okay, what do constellations and stars and rotating cycles in the heavens do? They map time. And why is that important? Because history proceeds through time. And the messaging is all of this is controlled. The passage of time and history and human destiny is controlled by whoever sits on the throne in the midst of all this. And in Ezekiel's vision, it's not a Babylonian deity like Marduk. It's Yahweh. So there they are, the exiles. Ezekiel has this vision, and the point of the vision is to say, like preachers like to say, God is still on the throne. Yeah, we're kicked out of the land. We're apostates. We violated the covenant, but God is still with us. He still has a plan. He is still in control. Now, I would suggest that John knows that. He understands Ezekiel 1. He understands the astral imagery. He understands the theological teaching point, and he uses that material. Or, again, God providentially gives him the material by virtue of the vision. It's probably a little bit of both. To communicate the same idea. Revelation is what? It's an apocalypse. Bad stuff is coming down the road. It's the end of days. Who's in control of all that? Who's going to make sure that the righteous are vindicated? Who's going to make sure that the nations are judged? And of course, they're God's. Why, that would be Yahweh's counsel. Okay, God is still on the throne. He is still ruling with his counsel like he, did, frankly, in the book of Ezekiel, but also, all these other passages we've cited, Isaiah, Daniel 7. Again, it is God. Think of Daniel 7. It is God who decides the flow of history and the destiny of empires, including his enemies. So I think John is trying to communicate the same things. Now let's go back a little more detail with the whole astral approach to Revelation 4. A little bit of ancient astronomy talk here. Egypt and Babylon. Okay, they're both going to factor in here because of some terminology and the way they understood things. So what Malina does is he makes these sort of observations, and I just sort of create a paraphrase list from his material. And again, he's suggesting, look, you got all this stuff to consider from an astral perspective. Maybe we ought to do that. And he moves from the textual observations to arguing that the elders specifically were decans. That's D-E-C-A-N-S. Decans are groups of stars that ancient cultures used to mark out specific phases or portions of the night sky. To be more technical, decan comes from the Greek word deka, 10, and the word, quote, is a creation of the Hellenistic period to designate the astral deities who dominate over every 10 degrees of the circle of the zodiac. That's Mal on the page 94. So a decan is a portion of the sky, by virtue of the terminology of 10 degrees. Now, Egypt and Babylon had a decan system of 36. 36 times 10, 360 degrees is a circle. It makes good sense. So Egypt and Babylon had 36 decans, dividing the sky into 36 sections of 10 degrees for their 360-degree system. The book of Revelation, is a product of a little bit of a later period, Hellenistic period. And the Hellenistic sort of approach to this differed from the older, 36. Okay, it opted for the number 24. Malina writes this. He says, Herodotus records that, quote, the Greeks learned about the sundial and the gnomon. Again, this is time and measurement stuff. And the 12-fold division of the day from the Babylonians. So Babylon did use 12 to chop up the day. Okay, so Herodotus records that the Greeks learned that from them. And he says, Malina continues, he says, by the 5th century BC, the civilized world from Babylon to Greece knew of 12 lunar months of 30 days. Then on the analogy of the year, the day, daylight plus nighttime, was divided into 12 larger, what they call double hours, and 360 smaller units. Does this sound familiar? We have a 24-hour day, and the 360 is 60, divisible by 60 minutes. Okay, so we inherit parts of this too. All right. So on analogy of the year, the day, daylight plus nighttime, was divided into 12 larger double hours and 360 smaller units. These time units were connected with the circular course of the sun, the moon, and the stars in terms of the same procedure. A circle's circumference consisted of 12 equal double segments and 360 lesser units in the Hellenistic system. Thus, by the time of John's Gospel, now pay attention to this, it's first century. By the time of John's Gospel, it is no surprise when Jesus asks, theoretically, are there not 12 hours in the day? It's John 11:9. It shows they're using this system. These 12 hours, Malina writes, corresponding to the 12 divisions of the celestial circle, are in fact double hours, hence 24 in all. Consequently, our seer, John, of the Apocalypse, book of Revelation, our seer could see 24 elders about the central throne of God. In a number of Israelite inscriptions from around the Mediterranean, a council of elders was called a gerousia, or a dekania, while a member of this council was called presbytes or presbyteros, which is the term translated in Revelation 4 for elder. Presbytes, presbyteros, these were synonyms for the Latin decurio and the Greek dekanos. There you go. So, it's the end of the Malina quote. For Malina, the fact that the elders surrounded the throne of God, was also visually significant. To him, it was an interpretive clue, along with all this other stuff. This description, Malina points out, and he's right, is unique in divine council scenes, where the members of the council typically stand either before the Lord, like Job 1, Job 1:6, Job 2:1, Daniel 7:10 has that language, or they stand to the left and the right. That's 1 Kings 22. Divine council members are, of course, the members of the heavenly host, the stars of God. This unique encircling, now catch what Malin is angling for with the circle thing, surrounding the throne. This unique encircling of the celestial council members, therefore, refers to stars encircling the throne of God in the heavens. For Malina, this arrangement depicted the rotating cycle of the zodiac signs that encompassed the decans, which were the elders. Now, he goes on. Malina cites comments of classical writer Diodorus Siculus. It's 2.31.4 for those who want to look it up, whose writings date to just before the Christian era. So he cites Diodorus in favor of his approach. He says, Diodorus wrote, beyond the circle of the zodiac, the Babylonians designate 24 other stars, of which one half, they say, there's your 12 and 12, are situated in the northern parts and one half in the southern. And of these, those which are visible, Babylonians assign to the world of the living, while those which are invisible, they regard as being adjacent to the dead. And so they call them judges of the universe. So he said, look, the Babylonian 12 and 12 thing, they're collectively called the judges of the universe. Dikastas ton holon. Now the wording here, judges, pretty obviously fits the context of Revelation 4 and 5, because this is the divine council scene that is convened to render justice in the last days. Now, again, you could get Malina's book if you want more of this kind of stuff, but that's really fascinating. Okay, it's really fascinating, and I think it's worth consideration and worth looping into this whole question of who are the 24 elders. Are they supernatural beings? Are they glorified righteous? Are they the stars? Yeah, I think all of these things are in play. It's really difficult to imagine that all of this stuff, all of these data, just take what we just went through with Malin. It's really hard to imagine that it's all coincidental or irrelevant to John's description in Revelation 4 and 5. In light of the use of astral language and metaphor for the divine council in biblical thought generally, particularly in light of Ezekiel's vision and its zodiacal correspondence, which John uses quite a bit. We got the cherubim right in here. That was the last episode of the podcast. We talked about the cherubim. It's right there. In light of astral language, metaphor, Ezekiel's vision, it seems best to include the astral approach alongside the motifs that identify the elders with both supernatural members of the council and glorified believers in the council. In other words, I don't see an obvious need to pick one of these three possibilities. The Old Testament council language employs astral terminology, suggests a glorified destiny for believers in that council. The New Testament solidifies the latter concept. A passage like Daniel 12:3, in fact, merges the ideas again in its foreshadowing. Quote, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." By the way, that's day and night right there. Brightness of the sky above, and like the stars forever and ever. 12 and 12. Okay, the grand idea is that God and his council control the flow of history and destiny. And these images communicate that truth. And John's doing the same thing Ezekiel's trying to do. It's going to get bad on earth. This is an apocalypse. This is the end of days. Who is in control? Is our destiny, is your destiny as a believer secure when basically the whole thing explodes? And the answer is, yeah, it is. In fact, on the other side of it, you're going to emerge as glorified children and co-rulers with God. And again, he's trying to communicate these ideas using all of this imagery. So I think, who are the 24 elders? What are they? I think it's all three. I think all three are in play.